Okay, welcome everybody to week 5, week 5 of our 2.1, which is going to be, I think, for a lot of you, the most interesting lecture so far, because it's about ancient Egypt and the incredibly rich culture that they created. And some of the legacy of that culture we still have with us today. Including some things that I don't think most people realize were invented by ancient Egyptians that we still use today. Okay, so we'll get to those things in just a minute. Let's see, is there anybody else here? Yeah, okay, good. So first, a couple of announcements. You guys know your papers are due 2 weeks from tonight. And so you've got time, but I certainly would urge you to, if you haven't already picked a work of art, you should do so right away and get started on the research. Then also, if you have any questions, you can ask me, of course, now or at the end of class. I always stick around, as you all know, as long as people still have questions after the last slide. But also you can, besides obviously emailing me between now and the next class, you could send me a portion of your paper to look at if you wanted me to give you feedback. But don't wait till the night or two before it's due. You got to give me at least say 48 hours before the due date, which is next Monday. So I'd need to get those by like Friday of next week if you want me to give you feedback in time for you to incorporate any, like say what you did well and what might be missing or what you need to add.
Did you say it's due next Monday?
No, 2 weeks from today.
Okay.
Yeah, you have until.
That's what I
thought. Yeah. Oh no, I'm not trying to scare anybody or push the date up. I need the time because my other classes I stagger the due date, so I don't get everything all at once. And of course, those have to be turned in as PDFs, and you're going to have the cover sheet. So I'm going to send the cover sheets to everybody, all 3 of my classes, probably by tomorrow night. So you'll have them in plenty of time, and you need to attach them digitally, of course, since that's the only way that this class can submit papers to me. In the same file if possible. That should be doable so that it's all together when they get graded. And your cover sheet will explain when you get your grade back, how you got the grade you got and why that point total is the one that you earned. Okay, now extra credit options. I think we've covered them in enough detail, but I occasionally get very creative questions from other students. And I can't remember which class it was, but somebody asked me, I think it was by voicemail, I can't remember. Can we watch a movie called Love Van Gogh or something like that? I can't remember the title. I know the movie that person was talking about because I saw it when it came out. It was spectacularly done. It was a European production, but the dialogue was all in English, about Van Gogh's last year of life and of course, fictional romance that supposedly he might have had. But that's not the focus. The focus is about his art, and that qualifies. So in other words, if you have questions about any option of an extra credit, you can, here we go. Welcome. We're just starting. We haven't got to the first slide yet. You can just check in with me either during class, of course, right? Or by email to verify. But something that's not strictly a biography is okay too. If it's about an artist or a type of art that interests you, and it's at least 60 minutes long, and it's not just totally fiction. It needs to have fact-based, information. And then you write 2 pages about what you learned from that movie, about that artist or that type of art. And that's worth 10 points. Okay, any questions now about your papers or your extra credit options or anything relating to what we covered in the last lecture? Of course, this will be posted on Friday, but I think this is the chance for a lot of you to add, because there's a lot of myths about ancient Egypt, including the movie The Prince of Egypt. I just watched that with my family the other night because my daughter was remembering that, and she's fascinated with ancient Egypt. Most people are. And in that movie, they got most things right in terms of the architecture, except for one big glaring error, which isn't as huge as some Hollywood productions have made. Like, it's who built the pyramids? I think everyone thinks it's one group of people, and it was.
Sorry, I do have a question.
Sure, questions are now.
If we visit the museum, should I submit right away or submit all my visit at once?
Oh,
like the pictures and all.
Okay. I would say it's probably best to do it as you go, so I can log them in one at a time. At least that's how I prefer to do it. Because if I get everything all at once toward the end of the semester, it's overwhelming. So I prefer, like, you go to a museum, you take a screenshot of, whatever the receipt, or, right, the admission ticket, whatever it is you have as written proof you were there on a certain date, the name of the museum, and then don't forget to attach your name and the class you're in to that email, and send it to me as either a screenshot or a PDF, and I will log it in right away as soon as I see it. Yeah, so don't wait, and unless there's no reason to do that. But it's.
I had a question about extra credit on photographing, interesting buildings.
Yeah.
You needed 4 sides. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. No, you can go to one building. The reason I mentioned the 4 is that the Julia Morgan buildings are private residences, and you can't walk. Well, you're not supposed to walk.
Right.
Their private property. You get
right.
I've had that happen
because I was down in
about those architects. So you stand on the sidewalk and take a shot. If that's the option, there are 4 all in Petaluma within a mile of each other, easily viewable and photographable. I think I have that right.
Well, yeah, I was
from the street, but that's the exception. Any others?
Because a couple of weeks ago, I was visiting my daughter in San Luis, and I found a very interesting building, but I could only get 3 shots of it. It was an old brick building that they had modified and used steel plates, so it became this old and new hybrid. It was kind of bizarre.
Well, can you get a detail with a telephoto or whatever, a close-up lens of one thing and then 3 other views? Yeah, the point is to have 4 views of the exterior, because they don't expect you to go inside during COVID.
All right.
Most people wouldn't let you, although you can go inside the Marin County Civic Center.
Right.
I think. I don't know. Now that I think about it, maybe they have some kind of COVID restrictions. Well, if you've been vaccinated, you have your vaccination card. I don't think they can prevent you from going in there, because courtroom's supposed to be public access. You know that,
right?
Some security thing, like a terrorist bomb threat or something. Anyway, the point is, most places you don't have to go inside during this period of the COVID outbreak, that Delta thing we're dealing with. Maybe that'll change before the end of this fall, but who knows? So all I'm asking is 4 views of the exterior. They could be 2 details and 2 side, a front view and a side view, whatever works, and in color. And of course, that you should use PDF format to submit them as one file with the name of the building, the location. That's all you have to write about that, and your name in the class, and send it to me. And that's worth 10 points. You can do that a couple of times. So that building, I don't know if you have a way of getting a 4th view of it. The one you just mentioned in San Luis Obispo is where Julia Morgan's records are for about 1/3 of all her blueprints. I'd say I did a lot of research there. Plus, there's the Frank Lloyd Wright building. It's in my book on Frank Lloyd Wright. And that building, hang on, let me get this. McKenna, welcome. Yeah. Okay. And Carlos, we're just about to get started with the first slide. I'm just answering questions about extra credit. Anyway, the point is that you should have 4 views in color of any one site, unless you're doing the 4 Julia Morgan houses, then 1 exterior of each house will do. Okay. So pick a building you can get 4 shots of from, whatever angle you're able to take them from. Hope that helps. Any other questions about, let's see, anybody have any questions? The papers, I think I've gone over them pretty well, but I know you'll still have questions. One thing I hope no one's still in doubt about, you can pick any work of art from any artist in any style and any period, any culture, except your own art, because that would be cheating. You surely already know the meaning without researching your own art, hopefully, unless you were high when you did. Oops, I should have said that. If you're creating works of art for yourself, that's great, but it's not research. So that's the only exception. Any other work of art, you can find at least 3 new sources to put in your bibliography and cite in the text, with footnotes or endnotes, is acceptable. Doesn't matter what type of art it is. I want it to be something, the point is, that you really care about, that excites you, interests you, makes you feel passionate about it, or love it or hate it, and you feel like commenting and learning more about it. Okay. All right. Any other quick questions? Because I will have time afterwards. We should get going on the lecture because it's quite a full lecture. And if time permits, I think it will, we will see my own slides of my trip to Egypt, where I didn't just go to Cairo and the Great Pyramids. I actually went down the Nile. It's like 400 miles, I think it is, to not just to King Tut's tomb, to the Valley of the Kings. And that's where Tut's tomb is, and went inside it, and you're going to get to see those slides. We should get that far at least. That'll be at the end where you won't even have to take notes on those slides. Okay, so let's start with the fact that ancient Egypt was one of the few, in fact, it's the only culture, at least in the Western world, it's always safest to say it that way, this side of India, okay, from the Mediterranean all the way across the Atlantic, that area of the globe. It's the only part of the Western world, or the only culture in the Western world, which had a 3,000-year history of uninterrupted cultural stability, with some, of course, there was some interruptions. There were up and downs when there were civil wars. I mean, that happens in just about every powerful empire, right? Or even countries. But other than those, temporary short-term interruptions, the Egyptians' system of government, their religion, their language, and their art consistently were uniform throughout 3,000 years. I don't know if another culture could make that claim to. The Romans lasted about 600 years. Well, if you go back to their earliest founding of the city of Rome, it's more like 900 years before they fell. That's a long time, but nothing close to 3,000 years. And even the ancient Greeks, the most you could say is maybe 1,200 years if you stretch it all the way back to the earliest Greek city-states up through the Romans, who conquered everything. And we'll get to them in a few weeks. So in other words, the Egyptians had the longest lasting, cohesive, you could say, or unified culture of any of the major ancient Western cultures. That's a major accomplishment. And they also invented several things. So what you should all have with you, remember each lecture in front of you, besides the syllabus, is the list of terms. Well, we have only 2 that I'm going to give you definitions for. We'll get to those when they're on the screen. But for now, just take a look at the list of things invented by ancient Egyptians. This might surprise some of you. Frescoes. The oldest frescoes we know, again, in the Western world at least, are on the walls of Egyptian temples and tombs, or the ruins of those places. They go back at least 5,000 years. Columns. Well, what did people use before? Well, look at Stonehenge. Those aren't columns. Those are monoliths, right? Egyptians were building temples 1,000 years before Stonehenge was completed. And they were using stone columns. They got the idea from giant trees, which is what they had first used for supporting their earliest temples. So say 6,000 years ago, when they were starting their urban civilization, they began to, here we go, let me admit this person, they began to use wood, large, heavy tree trunks, but that they rot. Of course, the wood doesn't last very long. So they came up with the idea, the Egyptians, of stone columns to support the roof or the ceiling of a building. Also temples. Well, again, Stonehenge, you might think, wasn't that kind of a temple? Well, in a way it is, but we're talking about the actual structure of building with 4 walls and a roof, and that is not what Stonehenge is, of course. So they credited with, again, most historians with inventing the concept of an enclosed religious temple. Okay, flat-sided pyramids, we already covered. Remember the ziggurats, or stepped pyramids. Those had been around since the early Babylonian times, but the Egyptians came up with the idea of the flat-sided pyramid, which is something that was then copied. It's everywhere. You see it even in Las Vegas, right? All over the world, but by other cultures. And the Romans did them. And even the French in their cemeteries under Napoleon, a lot of the people that died in all the wars he started, they were buried under fairly decent, like 20 or 30 foot tall mock pyramids. Well, they were pyramids, they just weren't as big as one. We're going to study the myths and dispel, I hope, for everyone, some myths or misconceptions about the Great Pyramids when we get to those slides in just a few minutes. Okay, and then obelisks. Well, let's wait until we see one, and then I'll define that. Obelisks, again, are things that are copied by other cultures long after the Egyptians first introduced them, and you can see them all over the world in different cities around the globe. Okay, so here we go. Just want to make sure this, I did see that it said it was recording, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just helpful to double check. Once in a while, if I don't hit it just right, it gets ticklish or something and then doesn't record. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Our first slide. This one is so important, I won't cut it from the list. Tonight, there are 4 of those. I know that sounds like more than I usually would do, but the Egyptian history and culture, it's so interesting and important to all the rest of Western history, right? Or world history, really. That's hard to cut that list down. So I will tell you, as always, when we have a slide, and this is one of them, on the screen, before I give you the meaning, make sure you take extra thorough notes because this has a high possibility of being on the midterm. Here we go. The title is Palette, P-A-L-E-T-T-E, of Narmer, N-A-R-M-E-R. The location is Egypt, of course. All of them are Egypt. The date, we don't have the exact date, but rounding it off, it was about 3,150 BC, or if you prefer BCE. Well, if you do the math, it doesn't take too much, right, thought process to go, let's see, that is over 5,000 years ago. So why are we looking at a piece of stone? A palette is a portable piece of stone. So you should start your notes with the meaning on that. What is a palette? It's a portable piece of stone that has been carved within a scene of an important event, from that culture, of course. So this is an Egyptian palette. What event does it depict? The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, or if you prefer saying the unification of Northern and Southern Egypt. Which is a major turning point in, world history, because before that, there were 2 separate warring kingdoms. And if they'd stayed that way, we probably never would have seen as much of the Egyptian influence in the world as we have today. So this guy, one of them is Narmer, the pharaoh that the palette is named for and who ordered it to be made, as you might guess, to record his victory. I think you can all tell before I even ask, which of these figures is Narmer and how do you know? But before we get to that, this, again, I'll repeat that, is really an important document because it records the founding of the unified kingdom of ancient Egypt. For the first time, Northern and Southern Egypt were unified under one ruler. And of course, his name was Narmer. So anybody, it should be obvious, can just say which figure do you think of all the things on this side? We're looking at one of the 2. It's a 2-sided piece. We'll see the other side in a few minutes. Which of these figures is the pharaoh? And how do you know? How can you?
The biggest one?
Yeah, exactly. Good first point. Here are the facts about how Egyptians portrayed their pharaohs. This is part of the meaning, of course, of this slide, and it will be on a couple of others. Whenever the pharaoh was shown in an Egyptian work of art, whether it's a bas-relief, it should be obvious this is a bas-relief. By now we've covered that term several times, right? It's a bas-relief panel, or a fresco, which is a painting, either a fresco or bas-relief, the 2 main kinds of Egyptian art, or 2-dimensional art. Whenever a pharaoh was shown in an Egyptian, bas-relief or fresco, he's always the largest figure. So that's one clue. Anybody else want to guess any other clues, maybe up in this area here, about what gives us a hint that this is Narmer, the pharaoh?
Scepter.
Yeah, the scepter, exactly. You can use either word. Actually, staff is one we're going to cover when we get to medieval kings, and after the fall of Rome. There's a slide called a stag staff, but you can use either word. Scepter is with a C, right? You don't have to worry about the spelling of any word that's not on the syllabus for the test, okay? A scepter is, I hope I have it right, S-C-E-P-T-E-R, or staff, which is slightly easier maybe to spell, S-T-A-F-F. Either one means a ceremonial stick. I know it sounds funny, right? Usually about 2 feet long, carried by a ruler, and that always symbolized their power. So yes, that is his scepter. But what about one other thing? I'm kind of hovering around it.
He's wearing the crown.
Yes. He's wearing a ceremonial, I'm sorry, the field. Oh, I almost misspoke. This version or view of Pharaoh armor shows him wearing one of the 2 types of crowns. You could say crown or headdress. Either word will suffice. This is the field headdress. See, because he's still in the field after the battle. In other words, he has just won the victory. So he was, just in combat, right? Just a little while before. So that kind of thing, which my daughter used to call, look like a giant bowling pin on top of his head, but it's a leather headdress that would have been worn by any pharaoh for all 3,000 plus years of their independent culture before the Romans conquered them. Well, actually, it was Alexander the Great that conquered them. So for 3,000 years, pharaohs wore that style of headdress or crown, you can say it either way, when they were in the field. There's a ceremonial kind that's even more famous, and you'll see that on the face, the funeral mask of King Tut, of course. So this is the field headdress. Those 3 clues put together, no one who, even the most illiterate citizen of ancient Egypt, would have known, oh, I see, that's the pharaoh, our leader, our ruler. And they would have known his name. So they know it's Narmer. Now, what about this guy? Anybody guess what's happening here? I mean, you might have an idea. Okay, it was a battle and 2 pharaohs fought each other. So you might guess who this guy is. Not the name. Don't need to know the name.
The enemy?
Yeah, the defeated, right. Yeah, the enemy of Narmer, or you could say the loser of that battle. He is being hit, and the old word I think it's in the Bible, is smite, to smite someone, S-M-I-T. You don't have to write that word. It's a sign of humiliation for the defeated one, because he's kneeling at the feet of the victorious Narmer, the defeated or losing pharaoh. And Narmer is showing his, obvious victorious position or position of strength by hitting the defeated pharaoh symbolically. He might actually have done it physically, but in any case, in this view, it's symbolically showing his superiority and the humiliation and inferiority of the other losing pharaoh. But here's another clue. Anybody notice a similarity here? That's the head, severed head, a few maybe minutes or hours later, of the defeated pharaoh being displayed in front of whatever, probably the soldiers who won the battle, as a victory trophy. That was a common fate, of course, in the ancient world, not just the Egyptians, but almost all the ancient cultures. Even the Romans did that. Yeah, they did. That's right, that late. Not always, but quite often they chopped the head off of the defeated ruler, general, whoever it was, rebel, king, whoever they were fighting when they won their victory, and put it on display somehow. So here he is. It looks like he's got his own, little stand here or base that he's been attached to. But then what is this? Well, this you probably couldn't know unless you know something about Egyptian.
Ra.
Well, not Ra. Ra's the god of the sun.
Horus. Yes.
Well, we can just keep it to, maybe you guys know. If you do, go ahead and speak up, anybody. The Egyptian name for the god of the pharaohs. Pharaohs could turn themselves in, according to Egyptian religious belief. This is part of the meaning of this, of course. A pharaoh could turn themselves into several types of animals because they were gods on earth, minor gods compared to the main ones. So this is the falcon version, you can say, or incarnation's a better word, falcon incarnation, one of the sacred animals that a pharaoh could turn himself into. So it symbolizes Narmer himself. And to me, I think he's doing his business on the head of, I mean, you decide, but it's another symbol of the humiliation and loss of the, defeated pharaoh. As if cutting his head off wasn't enough, then the pharaoh turns himself into a falcon. But anybody want it? Because it's not Horus. I know that, and I do know the main 3 or 4 main gods. Ra was the sun god.
Osiris?
I think it could be, yeah. But you won't have to know that. However, when we get to the 2 most important terms that have to do with Egyptian religion, the name of the sun god. I will spell them for you slowly because they're not that long. And the name of the pharaoh and his wife, you've heard of her probably. We'll get to that slide about right before the break. Nefertiti, who worshipped only that god, and that would be the sun god Ra. But we'll spell that when we get there. Okay, one last thing about before we leave. Oh yeah, these two are symbols of his birth sign. They believed in astrology. Most ancient cultures did. Quite a few modern ones too. And so I guess he was born as a Taurus, right under the sign of the bull. But who is this? Now there is a debate about this. Anybody want to take a stab at what does that guy look like? His function is.
Well, he's his valet.
He's a slave.
Say again. Sorry, I heard two.
He's either a slave or a priest.
Well, that is very interesting. So somebody, no, I think that's really a good thing that, I don't know who that was. It just said slave or a priest.
Levi.
I think you touched on the controversy or the discrepancy in the interpretation. There are two main theories about who this guy is. He could
or
be
taking notes.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Like taking some notes or something.
Yes. Yeah. You guys, that's excellent. Yes. Here's the two main theories. One is that he is a slave because if he was a, quote, sandal bearer, he would be a lowly servant who would probably be a slave, or you could just say
He's
servant.
barefoot himself.
But, well, so is the Pharaoh here, see. So, but some say, well, that must be his sandals. But there's a problem with that interpretation. This, no question, is a pot of ink or some kind of dye, and that's why the person who said they thought, I didn't catch the name there, of, yeah, this man might be a scribe. And that is someone who records or documents the main events for a pharaoh and follows him around and is not anything like a servant. A scribe is a highly respected, high-ranking official in ancient Egypt. You had to be educated, the best possible level, highest level of education, and be able to, write things down quickly in, of course, hieroglyphics, Egyptian form of written language, and then, take those documents and keep them, and retrieve them if the pharaoh wanted to read them later. And then, of course, that could be used, and also you probably had to be able to draw a scene like this that could be used later by the sculptor who created this panel. So when I was at the museum in Cairo, you don't have to write this, that's where this is. I saw this piece, and I asked one of the docents who spoke English, and he said most of our historians think it's a scribe, and that therefore these could be papyrus rolls. But, it's hard to say. Some people think they look like Converse tennis shoes. Don't write that. But they could be either sandals but if they were sandals, it doesn't fit that he would also be recording the event with a pot. Why would he be lugging a pot of ink around with him with a writing instrument barely visible, but it is sticking out of the pot here on the side there. So I think it's most likely, just say many, always be safe and write it that way. Many historians believe that this man was a scribe who followed the pharaoh with a pot of ink and papyrus sleeves, scrolls, sorry, already sort of early paper, right, early form, to document all the major events. Well, this is about as major event as you could get. So the pharaoh would have had a scribe following him around. But he could also maybe be a sandal bearer, who might, for some other reason, happen to have a pot of ink with him. I don't know. There's a dispute over that, and it's a debate that still goes on. Okay, so let's look at the back half. It's much less complicated. So we'll just summarize it quickly. Here we have the pharaoh in his ceremonial headdress. See him? That's a very different headdress, the kind you'll see on King Tut. Death mask. And there's that either sandal bearer or scribe yet again. Okay, now the fact that these people are barefoot doesn't mean anything except that they're on sacred ground, perhaps all of them, because this is a victory parade. This is clearly, there's no debate on this. These are symbolic. Of course, they had more than 4 soldiers and 1 officer or general. That's probably the general, since he's the second tallest. Well, yeah, he is. He's slightly taller than the scribe or sandal bearer. But that's probably his general who helped win the battle, commanded the troops into battle. And these men are symbolic with their different insignia or symbols of their regiments, whatever, their units, however you want to write that. They're in a victory parade. But here's the most interesting thing, maybe grisly as it is. Can you tell what this is? I'm giving you a hint where I'm pointing.
Looks like decapitated bodies.
Yeah, the decapitated bodies of the defeated soldiers with their heads stuffed between their legs. I mean, that's even worse than Crime Scene. What does that show? My wife and daughter like to watch that. Yeah, where body parts show up all the time. Anyway, the point is that is common fate for a defeated army in the ancient world. There were two choices. If you were relatively lucky, you lived and you were sold into slavery. Or if you weren't, you were executed. And yes, often that meant decapitation. That's what this is. See how these are stacked up like cords of wood. That's not how bodies would look at a pile, of course, but that's meant to show us from this angle how each person's had his head stuffed between his legs. And then the last thing I'll say about the meaning, then we'll do a formal analysis, is interesting because most people think those are giraffes. Well, if you look closely, they're not really giraffes. So you could say giraffe-like or mythical long-necked creatures, not clearly defined, being controlled by handlers. The handlers would be the regional, the governors, we'd say today, of the provinces that he just conquered. Southern Egypt, the southern half was, not just, one province, right, or one section. It was hundreds of, the Nile is 4,000 miles long. It's the longest river in the world, I think. I have that right. And it would have gone, at least 400 miles south before the border of the defeated southern kingdom. And then that section would go further down all the way to what's now Sudan, a country below Egypt. You have to write this, but that's hundreds and hundreds of miles. So they had to appoint multiple, the Pharaoh, Narmer, would have appointed, as soon as the victory parade was over, the local rulers, who ruled in his name of those provinces, the regional heads, and they would be, today we call them governors. So they're their handlers / governors, if you want to call them that, controlling Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolic of all the, local. And there he is again as a bull. And here's his, again, Taurus, symbol of his sign. Okay, let's go back to this slide. Why? I'm only going to show you this. If it's on the midterm, I don't expect you to write about both halves. Just to keep it simple. You only would need to describe the meaning of this half. Okay, let's do a formal analysis. Well, the Egyptians only knew two techniques for depicting space. And those are overlapping, of course. You see that here with the clothing over the bodies, right? And somewhat Narmer's body over the defeated pharaoh. And yes, there's your register line. So the scribe / sandal bearer, whatever he is following further away. Of course, he wouldn't be right behind the pharaoh. He'd be respectful distance behind him. So he's further away from us. So that's not a line. That's some kind of a, base, a wooden stand to put the display of the severed head of that defeated pharaoh. But these are register lines. So register lines are here for the two most prominent figures. Well, three if you count the defeated pharaoh. And then overlapping, that's it. There's no other techniques that Egyptians ever used for depicting space. Okay, and then we have the largest mass. That's easy, Narmer, of course. And then the second largest is the defeated pharaoh. And then it's a close call between the pharaoh incarnate as a falcon or the scribe. I'm going to call him a scribe because that's what my research tells me. So maybe he's the third largest and the scribe is fourth largest. Okay, we have good symmetric texture here. I'm done with carved line on the muscles and the clothing, the facial features of all the human figures, and on the feathers of the bird. The modeling is, of course, natural. Back then, it would have been sunlight or torchlight if it was at night. Shadows created by either, lighting in the palace. That's where this would have been displayed, of course, or today in the museum display. So that's what all bas-relief has to have. And you see the shadows outline the figures, or we couldn't see them. Is it balanced? That's harder to say. I think it is roughly, but because a lot of people would say if you do the line here, I'd say that Narmer's body and the smaller body of the scribe roughly equal the areas of these two sets of figures. To me, it's roughly balanced left to right and top to bottom, but if you feel it's weighted a little more towards the right, perhaps, I wouldn't argue with you there. But drawing a line right down the middle pretty much leaves only part of one arm of Narmer on the right side. You don't have to worry about these figures above and below. Okay, and then we have, it's mostly stable. Look how straight and upright he's standing. And at least his upper arms are almost, vertical or horizontal. And the scribe is upright. It's true the bottom half of the defeated pharaoh and his arms are dynamic. And the falcon is, so you can say it's a mixture, but the dominant part is the pharaoh and he's mostly stable. Okay, and then let's see. Color, well, it's a cool gray color of stone. And the rhythm is obvious with the repeated shapes of the arms, hands, legs, feet, heads. Okay. Now we get to the second slide, and you could imagine is so important. I won't be cutting this slide from the study list. Now, I would use one that's maybe a little easier to see the detail. And in some ways, I'm tending that way. I asked my in-person class, which I already showed these slides last week to that class, and it was like 50-50 as to which slide. This gives you the context, and it's a little more accurate indication of the distance between the pyramids. But it's I didn't choose this slide. It's faded. So this is one I actually took myself when I was there. So do people think this works as a view of the Great Pyramids? That's the next. You should be writing now the title of the second must-know slide. Again, make some notation in your notes if you choose that this is really important one. It won't be cut from the list. The Great Pyramids, plural, of course. Obviously, location is Egypt, and circa or little c means we don't have the exact date. Well, actually, we do for each one, but we round off the total of all three as 2600 BC or BCE. Okay, well, I think we'll use this because even though the first thing that a lot of people, I don't blame anyone if this includes anybody now here listening tonight, might assume that the biggest of the three pyramids, the one that's called the Great Pyramid, we're going to spend more time describing that one than the other two. The Great Pyramid, they might assume it's this one. No, it's this one, because this is why I thought this slide was slightly misleading. Let me just go back to that. Well, it still looks that way, doesn't it? The Great Pyramid is the largest of the three. And if I had, a blackboard or something to write on before we started, which I don't have here in my house, I could have written the fact that the name of that pyramid, I'll spell it, it's easy to write, is Khufu, the Pyramid of Khufu. That was the name of the pharaoh who had it built. Khufu, Khufu. Okay, the Pyramid of Khufu is the Great Pyramid. Those two terms are synonymous. But what that means is not only was it the largest, but it was the tallest man-made structure on Earth for thousands of years. How tall was it is part of the meaning now. It'll also come up when we do the formal analysis for space. Because with a building, remember, how do you describe space? You describe the dimensions, and if you know the height or the interior space, you write that. We'll get to that when you do the formal element. So for now, just under the meaning, you're going to want to say this was, when it was new, the Great Pyramid, or the Pyramid of Khufu, was 480 feet tall. 480 feet, that's a height of a 40-story skyscraper. Here we go. We just got started on the Great Pyramid, so you didn't miss too much. Yeah, just talking about the largest of the three. In this picture, it looks like, because it's further away, it's the one in the middle, but no, this is the Great Pyramid. That was, when it was new, 480 feet tall. We don't have to guess because there are kinds of records of that being built. The Egyptians kept records, but also they drew illustrations of these pyramids. Of course, they were famous all over the world. People in China knew about them. Speaking of which, I guess some of you already know the answer to this. Anybody know this fact? That the Great Pyramids are one of only two sites, the Great Pyramids, together, all three, are one of only two, and we can say man-made back then, because there's no question the workers on these were men, but there is a discrepancy on that too. We'll get to that in a minute. So these Great Pyramids, all three together, are one of only two man-made sites on the planet Earth that could be seen from 100 miles out in space. Anybody know what the other one is?
Hoover Dam.
Go ahead.
Great Wall of China.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is. The astronauts, when they first went up in space, told the ground crews and the people listening on. My mother used to keep us out of school to watch the first Americans go up in space. I was in grade school. I still remember that. Pretty exciting. Yeah, and they said, I can see the Great Pyramids. I'm passing over the Nile. You know, of course, the Nile itself is very visible. Yeah, so that's it. There are only two places built by human hands that are big enough to be seen from 100 miles out in space. And this is one of them. Okay, but that still doesn't give us the facts about the Great Pyramid. So let's go a little closer to that, which now is 20 feet shorter. No one damaged it. It's just worn down over, you know, almost 5,000 years. It's been sitting in the desert, you know, sandstorms and weather and all kinds of other things, you know, tourists climbing up it. So it's 20 feet shorter. Now that means it's still 460 feet tall. So, because anybody wanted, you could write this if you want to, is relating to that fact that it was the tallest man-made or human-built structure on Earth for millenniums, thousands of years. Anybody know what replaced it? It was only in not the 20th century, but the 19th century. Still standing. It's world famous. The first structure that was taller than this on the planet.
Empire State. Oh, no. Eiffel Tower.
Yes, exactly. The Eiffel Tower, which is just under 1,000 feet. But that was 1889. So that is just about 4,500 years. You could just say many centuries to keep it simple. The Great Pyramid, was the tallest man-made or human-built structure on Earth. That's a pretty amazing record. But here's another fact that you would have unlikely have already known unless you've been reading about these. It also was the heaviest structure ever built until, I don't know, well, into the 20th century sometime, until recently, just say. And how heavy was it? There are 2.3 million blocks of stone in the Great Pyramid. And remember, that's Khufu's pyramid, Khufu. So Khufu's, or the Great Pyramid, 2.3 million blocks of stone, each one of which weighed 2 to 4 tons. So the median weight was 3 tons, and right, most of you know that's 2,000 pounds times, that's 6,000 pounds for each average stone, the weight. I don't think you can do it on a calculator. I think at the break last week when I showed these slides in my in-person class, a couple of students did a calculation. It's in the trillions of pounds.
Did you say they're 2 to 4 tons each?
Yeah. Say again, please. Go ahead.
Did you say 2 to 4 tons each?
Yes. So the
Holy
median
smokes.
weight was 3 tons. If you use that as a calculating figure, yeah, you can figure that out. We're going to do it right now, and you don't need to know that for the exam, but it gives you some idea. This is a man-made mountain. There's no other way to describe it. But now we'll get to the biggest, probably most continuously held myth about the pyramids, or one of them. Who built them? I don't mean the name of the, you know, the architect. We might actually know, but what kind of workers built them?
Aliens.
Okay, good. Yeah, I read a book about the secrets of the Great Pyramid. And
Slaves.
No.
Slaves built them.
Okay, say again.
Slaves.
That's the misunderstanding everyone has. I did too for years and years. Till I think it was UC Berkeley art history class where
the woolly mammoth.
Not even close. Slaves were not allowed to touch any of the materials at the site. They were involved in carving stones for future use. For the hundreds of these were shipped up the Nile, hundreds of miles south was where the mountains they came from are. And so, yeah, slaves are certainly involved in the construction of a lot of sites, but not the tombs. I didn't say this, but I should have, unless you probably all know this. What were these used for? Why were they built? As tombs for 3 successive pharaohs, father, son, and grandson. And so as they were sacred, of course they were, because they were gods, literally a god on earth had just died. So you want to make sure his burial site is sacred, of course. that would be why they buried the pharaohs. I think everybody knows this, but if you don't, you should write it. Inside the burial chamber, or each pyramid had a burial chamber for the mummy of the pharaoh, and not all, but just say many of his worldly possessions, his most valued worldly possessions, you know, those that were portable, you know, like his chariot and his armor and his jewelry, you know, that kind
His cats.
maybe his cats, yeah, but not his wife. There's another myth. They didn't force the widow of the pharaoh to be buried alive with his body. I've seen movies like that. It's ridiculous. Quite a few of them outlived them, and I'll prove that to you when we get to King Tut, among many others. So no, they might have buried some of their favorite pets with them, yeah, because quite often those were already mummified, because of course usually cats don't live as long as humans, right? These pharaohs had these built as tombs of themselves, and why no slaves were involved is because it would have been sacrilegious. It would have been an insult or a desecration, is a better word, desecration of the sacred site. So who did build them? Paid workers who had a union. There's no debate over that. If you talk to anybody with, you know, an expertise in Egyptian history,
Masons.
you'll see that. Yeah, they had paid holidays. They had wage negotiations. They had to be the best, most reliable workers in the whole greater kingdom of Egypt, which had millions of people. Some people estimate 12 million. That's a lot of people from the ancient world to choose from. So they picked the most qualified, you know, and best educated. Well, not always. Some of them were grunts, but they were paid. The teamsters who hauled the stones from the river, you know, which is not that close, but it's, you know, several miles away from the Nile River barges where the, you know, the actual stones were loaded, offloaded, whatever. And then that maybe would be unskilled labor, but they weren't slaves. Those weren't slaves either. They were paid. The records exist, and we know they were provided with housing and food and paid holidays. Yeah, they didn't call themselves a union then, but they had what's called a guild, you know, and they had to be, because they were supposed to be not only highly trained and at least the more skilled ones well educated and respectful of the work they're doing, but they wouldn't therefore be desecrating this site with, you know, being touched by slaves, mere lowly slaves. We're not allowed to work on them. Yeah, I think that's the biggest myth about the pyramids. Okay, by the way, that movie, The Prince of Egypt, I had a misconception about it. One of my students called me on it, and I will say, I always do, I stand corrected, because I thought there was a scene where they showed the Jewish slaves, you know, the ones Moses freed, working on the pyramids. No, they didn't. They got that right. They worked on some of the other buildings in ancient Egypt, but they didn't work on the Great Pyramids, the tombs. And these were only used for a few centuries as pharaohs' tombs. There are other pyramids used by pharaohs as their tombs. These are just the three most famous because they're all close together. They're the largest and best preserved. Okay, so one other thing about them before we do a form analysis. Well, two more things. Can you see this here? Let's go up close. That's a limestone cap. That's the only one of the three that still has the exterior sheathing, you know, covering over the granite blocks of stone. And that would have been on all three of these. By the way, this is, you don't have to know, but you might want to. It's the pyramid of the son of Khufu, Kafre, Khafre, Kafre. And so Kafre was the son of Khufu. And so, as I said, this is three successive pharaohs, three generations of the same family, father, son, and grandson. And I don't know the name of this one who had this small. This one is about 100 and, I think it's like more like 110 or 20 feet. It's not much over 100 feet. This one is about 240 feet, maybe a little more, 250, say, rounding off. And this one is not quite, but nearly twice as tall as this one here. Certainly the one in the middle is well under 300. It might be 280. It's somewhere between 240 and 280 feet. So you could just say under 300 feet or between 250 and 300. And then we know the height of the Pyramid of Khufu, the biggest. I already gave you that. So these were used as burial sites. We know that all of the chambers, the burial chambers, were empty by the time the Greeks even came, or long before that, when Alexander the Great invaded. Of course, he was, well, basically Greek. I mean, technically not, Macedonia, but that's basically, he spoke Greek and he thought of himself as Greek. So when he invaded and conquered the whole kingdom of Egypt, he went inside each of these tombs and there was nothing in them. Anybody know why? The Pharaoh took his goods and went to the next life. That's what they told people.
Grave robbers.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, you don't have to have seen a Spielberg movie or, you know, any of the Indiana Jones ones to know that some elements of truth, as exaggerated as the details are in those movies. There were booby traps set, and for many decades, at least according to what I've read, grave robbers would die trying to get into this, but eventually some of them got through. And of course, after that, all the goods were taken out, all the valuables. And usually the mummies were just thrown aside, maybe into the desert, and there's nothing left of the mummies of these. That's ironic. They were meant to protect the pharaohs, and in the end, they did just the opposite. You know, King Tuts is the only tomb of the pharaoh we know of that was found intact with his body of all the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, and it wasn't a pyramid. They didn't use pyramids after the Old Kingdom. Oh, I did forget to say that. So this is the last fact about me now. This is from the first period of roughly 1,000 years, each of the three main periods of their 3,000-year continuous history, right, are divided into Old Kingdom. That's what these were. All the pyramids for pharaohs were only used during the Old Kingdom. Then there's the Middle Kingdom, which Nefertiti was part of. And then there's the New Kingdom, which Tut was, you know, at the beginning of, and all the way through to Cleopatra. She was the last pharaoh to rule the New Kingdom. So it's pretty logical. Old Kingdom, these are the pyramids, the Great Pyramids. Middle Kingdom, some of the tombs and temples we're going to see after this slide. And then Tut and everyone after him is New Kingdom. Okay, formal analysis. They are balanced, obviously. They're pyramids. By definition, they have to be balanced left to right, and of course, unbalanced toward the bottom. The color is a warm sand color, sandstone. Now, see, that's why I was going to use this slide, because that's the actual colors. But this is so out of focus. That's why I'm hesitating to use this slide.
You didn't quite finish. You were talking about, you said it's a limestone sheeting on the
yeah,
top.
you're right. You're right. One last fact about the meaning. Thank you for reminding me. What went on top of the limestone was white plaster that was then painted white, blinding white. Can you imagine three of these giant monolithic, well, not monolithic, but, you know, huge man-made mountains, whatever you want to call them, giant structures. They could be seen from, some say 100 miles, but certainly 70 or 80 miles away, because it's flat there. There are no mountains, that part of Egypt. You just have the river and the desert. So they could be seen. They were meant to be seen by travelers from, you know, tens of miles away, from maybe up to 100 miles away. That's a fact too. Most people would never have guessed that. And some historians believe they then painted symbols of each pharaoh's signs, you know, that those pharaohs believed in, or had some symbols for their ruling, or maybe even their favorite gods on the white paint after the white paint dried. But we do know that they were finished with after the limestone was laid over them with plaster that then was painted bright white. Yeah, that was the last fact I meant to mention. All right, so I already said they're balanced. The rhythm, pretty obvious. They're all the same shape, although they're different sizes. And of course, each block of stone is the same basic shape. Here, there's no line, carved line. It's visual lines. You could say each row of stones creates a visual line, but I think of it as just at the corners where the shadows, of course, that's where the modeling is. It's natural modeling only. No techniques for that from the sunlight. I already said the color is a warm sandstone. You kind of get an idea from this here. That's pretty accurate. And then we have the space. Well, I just mentioned that the largest one was 480 feet. The middle one was between 250 and 300 feet. And this one is a little over 100 feet. Okay, and then they weren't hollow, but they had the tunnel leading to a large burial chamber. And the burial chamber was in the middle of each of these pyramids. I've been to the burial chamber of the Great Pyramid, and I'll tell you what, hopefully if you ever go there, you hope never happens while you're inside the Great Pyramid. Something rather disturbing. But I'll tell you that after we finish. The last must know, time permitting. Okay, so what else we got? Let's see. Mass. Well, that's pretty easy. The Pyramid of Cheops. or Cheops is the Greek name. I should stick to the Arabic. Khufu, the largest one, is the largest mass, of course. The next largest is Sun's pyramid, Kafre, the middle pyramid, and the smallest mass is the one on the far left. Okay, and then let's see, stable or dynamic? Well, they're dynamic because of the angles of course, the sloping flat sides. And I think, oh, texture, it's only the real rough texture of stone. They would have been smooth when they were new because of the plaster. Okay, any questions? Somebody had a question? All right. This is, I don't know how this got in there. That's the slide librarian adding. It's like so out of focus. Okay, here's another one. Pretty important, the Great Sphinx. I'm probably not going to cut it either. Yeah, keep in mind that the first three are really important ones. So you want to take extra thorough notes. You already have, I assume, on the first two. So here we go. This is the Great Sphinx, just like it sounds, Sphinx, Egypt. And the date is 2570 BC. So we know the exact year that this was completed. And if you didn't already notice, it sits in front of the pyramid of Kafre, the only one with the limestone cap left, the second largest or middle pyramid. Pretty important part of the meaning, but that does not answer the question of whether or not this Sphinx, the Great Sphinx, quote unquote, they always mean this one, in this location in front of the pyramids, whether or not it's a portrait of an actual pharaoh. There are two main theories. One is that it is a portrait of Kafre, and people that believe that say, well, it's just logical because it's in front of his pyramid, and why would a Sphinx be built in front of a pyramid if it wasn't a portrait? Well, let's go up to the other views. I have other views. You see how close it is to that, and you see how far apart they really are, right? Yeah, Getty images there. They own everything, don't they? Missing the nose, we'll get to that myth. What happened to the nose is probably a commonly held myth among most people, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I just want to make the point, the two theories, there's a discrepancy, or dispute is a better word, dispute. Okay, it might be a portrait of Kafre, but we don't have any evidence of that. So what is the other leading theory? That it is just a general image that symbolizes the strength and power, you could even say majesty if you want, the strength, power, and majesty of all the pharaohs. I think that makes the most sense. There are two reasons why many historians think that is more likely, that it isn't a portrait of any one pharaoh, for these two reasons. First of all, these men had monumental egos. We can see that, right? They had an edifice complex, they call it. Not Oedipus, that's the Greek myth, right? An edifice complex, it's just a phrase I like to use to describe people that have to build big buildings that commemorate their memory, right? So they all had the capacity to, and the wealth, the power to build whatever monuments to themselves they wanted. Why wouldn't some of the other two, either one or both the other two, build a Sphinx in front of their pyramid? It begs the question. But even more, I think, convincing for that argument, that it is a generic image. The strength and power of all pharaohs is this. It's my own slide. Pharaohs all the way through ancient Egypt had sphinxes that were symbolic of other predecessors or family members. It was considered by most people in ancient Egyptian religion, pharaohs and the higher educated classes, the royal family, and even some of the peasants, to just symbolize the power of the pharaohs themselves in general. And these are all over Egypt. This is one, you have to write this now, in the basement of the Louvre. She didn't know the Louvre had a basement. I didn't either until I was in Paris, one of my many visits, my favorite city in the world. And one of my friends knew someone who worked there. And she said, hey, we can meet that person and he'll take us down to the basement. This is a 15-foot tall stone Sphinx with a 30-foot long body. It's the second largest, the largest Sphinx figure, right, ever taken out of Egypt. I'm guessing it was stolen by Napoleon soldiers or somebody under French rule. But anyway, the point is that it's in Paris now, but it's so much similar to all these others. And this one is missing its beard, which could be it never had one. And we know Kafre had a beard, but that doesn't prove it isn't Kafre, because it could have just fallen off like we know the nose did, or did it? Anybody know what happened? Or have you heard the myth, some of you, of how the nose went?
The beard is actually in a British museum. And it's
I was going to say a beard. I think a beard would have been. All the pharaohs had to be shown with a beard, because that's a symbol. Remember, I mentioned this earlier. I think I did, of the power. Yeah, we did with the Babylonians, and the importance of a ruler. Yeah, so even Tut, who was too young to grow a real beard when he died, he wasn't even quite 20. We'll see, though. They put one on his mummy. Yeah, so there's no question that there probably was a beard here. So that doesn't prove anything either way, one way or another. In any case, there's a debate, you could say, or dispute over it, and no one can say for sure because no written evidence has come to light to prove.
Plastic surgery.
Say again?
Plastic surgery gone horribly wrong.
Whoa, yeah. What nobody has mentioned what might have caused the nose to go missing. There's a myth. I'm surprised nobody said it yet.
Napoleon shot it.
I know. I was raised with that one too. No, it was missing long before we know, because there were engravings of this by European explorers from the 1500s, 300 years before Napoleon invaded Egypt, with the nose missing. However, the Turkish army, which occupied Egypt for 500 years, could have used it for target practice. It's not proven, though. So, much more likely is it wore off from the weather. The desert is a harsh climate, right? And so it could have just fallen off due to weather over literally thousands of years. I think that's more likely. But we have no proof that certainly it wasn't Napoleon's soldiers, plus which he admired the Egyptians. He emulated both the pharaohs and the Roman emperors in all of his style. Everything he wore and his furniture and the style of architecture he liked was modeled after ancient Egyptian and Roman culture. And so he would not have if any one of his soldiers had done that, we know they didn't because it was already missing, he would have had them executed probably. Because he was present in Egypt when they, some places he had a soldier invade and he didn't go, but he went to Egypt personally because he wanted to see it for himself. He went inside the Great Pyramid and came out white as a ghost. You have to write this. I don't think I've said this in years, as did Alexander the Great. And the theory is that both of them saw their own deaths, if you believe in whatever supernatural thing. Inside the missing, the chamber of the missing bodies of a predecessor of theirs, right? A world-renowned ruler, high-powered person. And, of course, those three pharaohs didn't die violently, but Napoleon, he just died in exile. Alexander died in battle, though. Yeah. So who knows? Who knows? All we know is that the nose had been missing for centuries by the time the first European. Sorry, somebody speaking up, because I can't tell if that's a background noise or a question. Okay, let's do one or two more facts about the meaning of this and do a formal analysis. This is not what most people assume. Here's another misconception. Oh, what is a Sphinx? I didn't really say, but it should be obvious. But if it isn't, you should write this. A Sphinx is a mythical Egyptian creature with the head of a pharaoh and the body of a lion. That's the only real definition that no one argues with. As to whether some of them were done as portraits of individual pharaohs or not, the debate rages. We don't know for sure. What we do know is it was not made from blocks of stone brought here like the Great Pyramids. It's carved out of the desert floor, literally. Now, these are blocks of stone brought here to restore it. It's been restored several times over the centuries, I keep saying centuries, nothing, millennium. And there's no, the plural of millennium is millennium, right? Millennia. Yeah, over thousands of years, it's had to be restored many times. So these blocks of stone were imported from somewhere else, but not the body, the main body or the head. That's the original stone used that was carved out of what this was a hill in the desert. It was probably about like this. And they just carved it away. It's called carved out of living rock. And you're going to hear that phrase a few more times in this course, because that's a technique ancient builders use quite often, because that rock is strong enough to support, but actually it is a softer stone than the pyramids. That's one reason it needed more repairs, much more. In fact, they haven't been repaired at all, the Great Pyramids. This is sandstone, which is what the desert's made out of. If it's not the sand, what's below it is called sandstone. So this, once again, this whole figure is carved out of the desert floor, not blocks of stone put together. Now, another fact about it, and then we'll do the formal analysis, is that it was the largest statue ever carved in the ancient world. And I've had a few people, almost every class, someone will say, oh, wait, what about the Colossus of Rhodes? This was a 65, no more, 70 foot tall, somewhere between that. So it's a nearly 70 foot tall figure from head to foot, and 165 feet long. So if it stood up, right, or if you measure it lengthwise, it way over is way over the length or height of the Colossus of Rhodes. Was 105 feet tall. And I think it was that one that the Greeks built was probably the second largest statue in the ancient world, or one of the largest. But this was the largest. So again, this has a pretty important place in world history for that reason alone, that it was the largest sculpture that had ever been created up until that time, and remained that for many thousands of years. Yes, it was in the 19th century again when anybody know what the statue, it's pretty famous. I'll say, give you a strong clue. It's in this country that finally was taller than.
Is it made out of copper? Did it come from France?
Yeah, exactly. The Statue of Liberty is about 205 feet from the feet, not counting the base. And then in Russia, and my daughter's from there, there's one that's 305 feet. It's called Mother Russia. It's commemorating the victory over the Nazis. I haven't seen that one. I've seen others that were 200 feet tall in other parts of Russia. But it turns out, one of my students in class last week said, oh, but that used to be the tallest statue for decades after World War II. But now it's in China. There's a 500-foot tall statue. I don't even know who it is of, Not Mao, I don't think, or we have heard about it, right? The founder of Communist China. Anyway, we would just say there are many taller pieces now, maybe, but not in the ancient world there weren't. This was the largest sculpture. Okay, formal analysis. It's
the Colossus of Rhodes
color. Right, the color is clearly warm, just like the pyramids and the sand around it. It has similar texture, only visible mostly on the head now because of the deterioration. This has been restored to where you can see some of the paws now. Well, actually, let's go to the next view and you'll see what I mean. Yeah, this shows you how there is some restored similar texture on the paws. But the rest of the body is a real rough texture of the stone. And then we have the similar texture of the face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, all those features. And that's all done with carved line, of course. The modeling is just the shadows from the sun. There's no technique. It's not hollow. There's another myth. I've had people say, it wasn't there a treasure buried in, or bodies of, no, never. It's solid. Yeah, so it's a solid piece, a single mass. There's no larger, smaller mass. And again, for space, I mentioned, but it's the real dimensions of roughly 70 feet high, 65 to 70 feet high, or nearly, you could just say nearly 70 feet by 165 feet long. And it is almost entirely stable. If it's on the exam, I think I'll show you this view because you can see more of a close-up of the body. That would mean that, let's see, what are we missing here? Oh, rhythm, of course. The paws create rhythm. The headdress of the Pharaoh, that's the ceremonial headdress of the two eyes, the two ears, and so forth. Of course, now the nose is missing, so you can't mention that as rhythm. Two nostrils, you don't see them. Okay, but it's plenty of rhythm. And I already said it's one solid mass. It's not hollow inside. Oh, balanced. Yes, left to right, but obviously unbalanced toward the bottom. And it is entirely stable, except for the headdress. Look carefully. Even the top of the head is basically flat. So it's almost entirely stable. The very ends of the paws, you can see, is a small amount of dynamic detail. Okay, we'll do two more and we'll take our break. I'm going to skip this for now because I want to do this and one more muscle and we'll see what time it is. Okay, this is the bust of Nefertiti. Bust, of course, of Nefertiti is Nefertiti. Egypt, of course, and the date is 1348 BC. She was one of only three women in the history of all of ancient Egypt to actually have real power, to be an actual ruler, not behind the scenes, but actually openly rule. But she wasn't by a sole ruler, as I think many of you already know if you read your Stockstead or studied Egyptian history. She was a co-ruler with her husband, and his name was Amenhotep. So I'm going to spell that for you now. That's Amenhotep. But he changed his name to Akhenaten, and that's A-K. You know what? I'll hold this up at the end of the lecture so you can see these and take a screenshot if you want, but I'll spell them now. He changed his name midway through his reign. He changed his name partway through his reign. Akhenaten. Akhenaten, one word. Well, you don't have to know the exact spellings. So if you just want to write them as closely as you can phonetically, that will work. There's a reason why that's not a minor detail, because he started out when he was co-ruler with his wife. Right there, that's unusual, that he gave her equal power. Very rare. He started out with all the old gods. All the pharaohs did. They all had to agree to maintain the temples and pay the salaries of the priest, right? And the people worshipped whatever gods they liked, at any one time. They had dozens of gods, And then suddenly, halfway, or just say partway through their reign, their joint reign, Nefertiti and remember his name before he changed his name was Amenhotep. They decided to change the rules, the religious rules, and they said no more worshiping of all the other gods. Only one God, Ra, R-A, would be allowed to be worshipped, the sun god. And the other word for him is, that's an easy one to spell, Aten, A-T-E-N, Ra, just like it sounds, Ra. So that caused, you could imagine, a lot of anger. All kinds of, tell people they can't worship the gods they grew up with. And well, you can imagine the priest class, there were hundreds of thousands of priests throughout Egypt. They simmered with resentment and they swore they overturned that rule. So within a few years, there was a rebellion against their rule. And this is an important part of the history. And they were overthrown. She disappeared somehow during the siege of the palace, right? It was attacked by, I guess, a mob, maybe soldiers. But in any case, it was attacked, and she and her children disappeared. No one knows what happened to her. There's no records, no evidence to prove whether she survived, went to a neighboring kingdom for sanctuary, blended into the crowd. That's one theory. I don't think so. Look how distinctive her face was and how she was so well known throughout Egypt because of her beauty and her strength and her power and her intelligence. She was greatly admired, except for when they made the mistake, she and her husband, of trying to force this new religion. None of the Egyptian population had ever thought of only one God before. Only the Jews did. Right? They believed in one God, of course. So this was a mistake they made, and it cost them their rule. But Akhenaten, now he's called Akhenaten, the new name for Amenhotep, he survived, and he continued as a puppet ruler, right? The real power was, behind the throne. And I'm sure he remarried. The point is he continued on after he was allowed to do that. But she disappeared, and no one's found any evidence of what happened to her. If she did die, what happened to her body? There's no mummy. We don't know. Now, one more fact about this is a life mask. This was done from, I should say, a life mask, not a death mask. While she was at the height of her power, we know that she actually looked like this because the sculptor was named, you don't have to know his name, but I'll give it to you, Thutmose, just like it sounds, T-U-T-M-O-S-E. Thutmose was the royal sculptor. He admired her. Some think he was in love with her, but we don't know that. All we know is he did dozens of busts and portraits of her, and they were all found intact in his studio when a group of German archaeologists / thieves, I call them thieves for what they did. You can see the evidence. They stole most of those busts, including the most famous one. And can you believe this? This is all part of the meaning of this slide. This would be intact if it weren't for that theft, because on the way back to Germany, at some point, it was in a crate. They dropped the crate, and that's how her eyeball and her ears were damaged. One eyeball went missing, and both ears were damaged. Otherwise, it would be intact. I mean, that's kind of tragic, if not pathetic. Those thieves couldn't even do that right. They could. So it's in Berlin, in a museum in Berlin, Germany. And the Egyptians want it back, and they keep trying to get the, United Nations, whoever it is that has the power to try it. But the Germans aren't going to, it's too big a tourist. Millions of people a year come to see it. I've seen it in the museum in Berlin. So that's why it's in Germany now, not in Egypt, and why it's damaged, because of that disgusting act of theft and incompetence of the thieves themselves, damaging this priceless piece in transit. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning. Balance, totally, isn't it? I think her headdress balances out with her shoulders and necklace, but if you think it's a slightly wider or taller, you could say it's weighted toward the top. If you were to look at the side view, you would probably say that the headdress is the largest part. If you break it down into masses, it's the headdress first, then her head and neck, and then her shoulders. But it is balanced visually, left to right. And I would say top to bottom if you draw the line across her forehead there. And then the rhythm is obvious with the decorations on her headdress, on her necklace, on her eyes. Obviously, all that is done with carved and painted line. You see painted line on her eyes and eyebrows and the necklace, and of course, carved line everywhere else. Very accurate, very realistic, and there's no technique. Excuse me, I have to take a drink. No technique for modeling. It's just the shadows from the museum lighting. Warm on her skin tones. And by the way, these people were neither, certainly not light-skinned Europeans, the way one silly historian tried to maintain that ridiculous concept. But neither were they sub-Saharan Black African, but they did intermarry. Many of the ruling class did with Black African tribes who had their own kingdoms around Egypt, and many of the people in ancient Egypt were of mixed race, even among the ruling class. They weren't hung up about race. I think that's one of the most admirable things about them. They were the first multicultural society on earth, at least major one. 5,000 years ago, they didn't worry about what you look like or what your ethnic background was. They more concerned about what you did, not how you looked, which is, something that many societies still have to work towards today. Okay, we have the dynamic features are the necklace and the headdress, but her head and her neck are straight upright. So I think it's more stable than dynamic. It's the top of the headdress flares out and the necklace. So to me, it's more stable than dynamic, but you just say it's a mixture. And of course, the cool tones are the green gemstones, or decorations, I should say, on her headdress, and actual gemstones, blue and green, on her necklace. I think I've said that the rhythm, obviously, already mentioned that. And it's for space. There's only overlapping the headdress and the necklace over her body. It's a life-size adult human female's head or bust. Okay, we'll do one more and we'll take a break. This one won't take as long. This one is the Temple of Hatshepsut. And that's H-A-T, it's the fourth one on your list. S-H-E-P-S-U-T, Hatshepsut. Again, if I spell these several times, we'll never get through the semester. So they're on your syllabus. You should have that in front of you. Temple of Hatshepsut.
I have a question about the last one.
Restaurant menu item. Well, maybe. But she was one of the only 3 women who had real power in the entire history of ancient Egypt. Of course, the location is Egypt, and the date 1458 BC. So
I think somebody had a question about the last one.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Did you touch on texture?
I think I did, but I might not have. I might have skipped that. Yeah, thank you. That's always important to if I overlooked something. Yeah, it's super sharp and realistic on the skin, on the jewelry, the necklace, and I would say the headdress even. but certainly, especially on the face, the lips, right, and the cheeks and the eyes. So yeah, it's very realistic. And that's carved and painted line that creates it. Yeah, thank you. Okay, that's important, yeah. All right, this one is a temple to one of the only 3 women who ever were rulers. And this woman was one of only 2 Egyptian rulers who had sole power. She did not have a spouse or a family member or someone behind the throne telling her what to do. She ruled for over 20 years. I think it was more like 22 years. Independent, really rare. And she wasn't hiding the fact that she was a woman. Sometimes she'd dress as a man when she toured the kingdom, sometimes by choice, but she didn't hide the fact that she was a woman, and almost everyone in the kingdom of ancient Egypt at that time knew they had a woman ruler. Pretty unusual, right? For whatever reason, there was no male heir at the time she was of age, and her predecessor, I don't know if it was father or uncle, somebody had died. So she had this temple built to her, and there are many people who claim that it was a spontaneous gesture by the people of Egypt because they liked her so much. Why? Because she actually spent money, not just lip service, not just, political pandering, but she actually spent money, that is the government of Egypt that she, of course, controlled, on improving the conditions of at least many, not all, but many of the working class. And the proof of that is the housing that were built right outside. If time permits, I'll show you some of the housing. Today, by today's standard, it wouldn't look so great. But you got to remember, there's plenty of homelessness in the ancient world, plenty, more than there is now in our cities. And so if she housed workers and gave them a permanent place to live and food and a job, something to do with their, skills, then that would make her very popular. So she was popular with just say many, if not all, of the masses of ancient Egypt. And here she is as a sculptural figure, right, attached to the columns on her own temple. But this slide is really kind of misleading because it doesn't show the 3rd level. This must be really old slide, because when I was there, it was in the 80s. That's a while ago, right? You'll see. I think we'll get that far with my own slides. The top level is completely restored. It's a 3-level temple. And that's not a minor feat because it's all carved out of living rock. Remember I said earlier, that phrase will come up several times during the rest of this semester, especially before the midterm. So if you look, you can see the evidence of that. You see the marks of the blades, whatever kind of blades they used. Obviously it had to be blades and chisels, things, to carve out of the side of the mountain. Well, this is called the Valley of the Kings. Over that hill is where Tuts' tomb is. You'll see my slides of that again after the last must know. And that is on the other side of the same range. So it's kind of fitting in a way that they would have had a separate valley for the queens because there weren't that many. Now, the queens were, of course, the wives of the pharaoh. So I just told you they didn't bury them with that silly. I don't remember how many movies in the 50s and 60s showed that happening, about ancient Egypt. No, unless they asked to be, but I don't know any who did. Most women, in general, throughout human history, women usually outlive men in any given culture in any given period. That just tends to be the case by several years. So if they did, they could then have a separate funeral with a separate burial and have their own tomb. So this is the Valley of the Queens. And we don't know if Queen Hatshepsut was ever buried here. There's no evidence to prove either way. But we know this temple was built during her life and people came to worship her here because after all pharaohs are gods on earth. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole meaning. The formal analysis, well, it's 3 levels and the space is divided this way. The ground level has 20-foot high ceilings. It's one long open room, if that's not obvious here. My slide is better than this, but it's not in the slide library. So this is from the slide library. The second level, at the middle level, his ceiling's around 15 feet high. I've walked all around this place. And then the upper level you can't see here because it wasn't yet restored, has ceilings of about 10 feet high. So it gets progressively shorter as it goes up, which makes sense, obviously, because obviously the heaviest part of the building should be on the bottom. And then we have modeling is the shadows, deep recessed shadows created, by the deep recessing of the rooms. And then the rhythm is powerful, isn't it? These are actually square versions of columns, but they qualify as columns. Columns usually you think of as round, but these are columns. They're just a different shape. And then we have the texture is the real rough texture of the stone. There is similar texture on our statues, but you can't really see that. It's entirely stable. The only thing dynamic is the staircase leading up to it. That is the original staircase, by the way. And then we have, let's see, I already mentioned the rhythm, right? Let's see. Oh, yeah, balance, yes. Left to right, the whole thing is symmetrical, of course. But, of course, it's unbalanced or weighted toward the bottom. The line here is all carved line. Well, it's both. The carved line is only on the, sorry, I misspoke. The carved line is limited to the sculpture. By the way, on the staircase are several sculptures of her as a goddess. I'll show you those, time permitting, of my own slides. So there is carved line on this, her figures, but the rest of it is visual line, formed by the shadows, of course. Color is a warm sandstone. And I think I said it's stable. There is nothing really dynamic at all except the staircase. Okay, let's see. I'm thinking if there's one more thing I wanted to mention about this. Yeah, let me just prove a point. I'll take 2 minutes or less. I skipped this. This is a prince and his princess before they became pharaoh in the Middle Kingdom. Prince, you don't have to know, it's not a must know. Rahotep, I like that name, and his wife, Nofret. Love that name. She never worried. Nofret, just like it sounds, and Rahotep with an H-O-T. They became later pharaoh and queen. Okay, here's the point why I show this. This is his actual skin tone. He was pre-Arabic. That is North African. It's definitely not European or white. Neither is it sub-Saharan Black African. But her skin tone looks as though she might be, right, a different race. No, that's a device used by Egyptian artists to portray upper-class women for two reasons. One, they actually wore white pancake makeup. You'll have to write in this. I just think it's very interesting to know. You can see this in any great museum with Egyptian, sculpture or frescoes. They're all over the East Coast. We don't have any. Well, there is the one in San Jose. You can go there. That's for 10 points. My daughter used to call it the Mummy Museum. The Rosicrucian Museum, it's the only museum in the whole Bay Area that has mummies, but they're nothing, not like this. They're not royal figures. They're cats and children and families and stuff. But the women in the upper classes are portrayed in any Egyptian art, when color is used for skin tone, as having a white skin tone, because they did use that kind of pancake makeup as both a sign of their upper class beauty and to protect their skin from the sun. But it became just a device to symbolize the different genders between men and women, assuming that was then, of course, the binary system of differentiating men from women. In their art, the tradition was women were almost always shown with a lighter skin tone than the men, even though they had the same skin tone. Her skin tone was undoubtedly the same as Nefertiti's, or very close. So what I said earlier, the king later in the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, Tut being one of them, his mother was sub-Saharan Black African. We know, we have portraits of her, statues of her. Some were found in his tomb. So he was mixed race. And in case that's not obvious, you're going to see him when we get to, look at that. He definitely had sub-Saharan African features, but he was of mixed race. Pre-Arabic or North African mixed with, his father probably was of that background, with a sub-Saharan Black African ethnic origin. Again, the point is they weren't hung up about race, this culture. They consider people by how they behaved and what they did, not how they looked. Okay, we'll start with this after the break, okay? We'll take 20 minutes, so about 8:20. See you all. Okay, so let's resume, and we have just 3 more, that's no slides, but the last 2 are pretty rich in lore, I'll call it, which is, again, some of the misconceptions about King Tut will, I hope, dispel here tonight. And then I'll segue right into maybe 20, 25 minutes of my own slides of both the Great Pyramids and King Tut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and even a little bit of the Nile itself, so you can get an idea of how amazing it is. Okay, so this one is the temple, pylon of Ramses II. Pylon is Pylon of Ramses. Some say Ramesses, some say Ramses. Rameses. Ramses II, it's a Roman numeral, right? At Karnak, Karnak. There are several temples that he built, so that's why the title needs to include the location. Egypt, and the date is 1280 BC or BCE. Okay, so this is the entrance to a temple complex, and if you saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, I believe that's the one, I can remember which one of the Spielberg Indiana Jones movies, where they build a model of this actual temple, where a model is actually in the underground, right, where they get trapped and whatever, that one scene. That actually is a pretty accurate depiction of what this was in miniature. This was the largest temple complex, here's the first fact about the meaning, in ancient Egypt. It ran for a mile along the Nile. That's how I like to put it. In other words, it was a mile long, and this was the entrance to it. It was built by Ramesses. I always pronounce the way I've always heard it, Ramses. Oh, if you saw the, well, there's several movies where he's a character, including the one I just mentioned. That's a cartoon, fairly accurate about the architectural legacy, and that's the Prince of Egypt. And then there's the live action movie from way back before any of you probably were born, which is, of course, called The Ten Commandments, in which a Russian actor, Yul Brynner, plays Ramses. But here's what you need to write about Ramses. Two important facts. He was the longest ruling pharaoh. There was one who was on the throne longer, but he was a little child when he took the throne. That doesn't count because he didn't rule for the first several years. Ramses actually ruled all of Egypt for 62 years. That's a long time, so longer than most people lived. A, and B, he was nicknamed, besides Ramses the Great, they all called themselves that. His preferred nickname was Ramses the Builder, because he built more temples and more monuments, mostly to himself, than any other pharaoh. Well, he had longer, of course, to do it, but he was fairly popular, despite, the mishap with the not letting Moses take the Jewish slaves away. And how much of that is true and how much of it is myth is up to you to decide. We're not even going to go into, but this is the same pharaoh we're talking about that those stories mention. That pharaoh, Ramses. And there was such an incident where the Jewish slaves were allowed by some kind of pressure, some kind of inducement to leave and go free from Egypt. Moses was a real person, of course. What happened once they left and went to the desert, the Red Sea, parting, that's whatever you believe is your business. But what we do know is Ramses here was trying to build a temple to not just commemorate himself, because these are statues of himself in front of the temple complex. It's been restored. These are from the slide library in Santa Rosa. They're not brand new slides. They're not ancient, but there's about a dozen sculptures of him now. It's been restored pretty much across the entrance, and that's what we think the original entrance looked like. In the movie, by the way, if you care, the cartoon version of this, the Prince of Egypt, the only fact they got wrong is they showed a giant Sphinx being built in front of this temple complex. That never happened. There wasn't a Sphinx here. What was there? An obelisk, and that's one of only two definitions for tonight. It's very easy. They're both fairly short. An obelisk, I'm pointing to the one here, right, is a tall, narrow piece of stone. Okay, a tall, narrow piece of stone carved with scenes of important events from that culture's history. Carved with scenes of important events from that culture's history. Well, this is important events from his reign. He was commemorating himself and his accomplishments. Okay, but there's more to the meaning here. What is a pylon? These are pylons. The Egyptians invented this technique, and you can see them again all over the world. Even in Tibet, they have pylons now, where the Dalai Lama, I can never say his name, his title, I mean, if you say it fast, you know, is going around the world. He used to live, right, when he was younger, before the Chinese took over Tibet. Look at a picture of that palace, and it's been in many movies and documentaries and news reports. They have parts of that complex have this exact same shape. The Egyptians invented this idea of sloping walls, which, putting them side by side, become the entryway to a complex, usually a complex of temples. And this was a complex to the gods who protected the pharaoh. And that's why it's called the Temple of Amun, this particular temple. But you don't have to remember that. You could just say he built it both to commemorate himself and his reign, and as an offering to the god that protected all the pharaohs, not just him, but every pharaoh. If you want to know his name again, it's Amun, A-M-U-N. So this is an important complex, wouldn't it be? Yes, it was the largest, the longest, probably the most ornate. But one last thing about the meaning. Why would anybody want to get, the entrance is so narrow here that only one or two people, probably a single file, can get into this temple complex at a time. Can anybody guess why do you think that it might have been designed that way?
Defense.
Say again?
Defense.
Yeah. In one word, yes, you could leave it that way. Yeah, I was going to say, yes, to defend it against all kinds of intrusions, whether it's theft, riots, or some crazy person bent on, killing people. I mean, they had their nutcases too. Every society does, right? Throughout history, there have always been a few nutcases that are loose cannon. And so they knew that, and so they could protect. And as if that wasn't enough to keep the entrance so narrow that only one person at a time can get in, they had guards stationed 24 hours a day behind these windows who could look out over the crowd. And if they saw somebody who looked threatening approaching, they would tell, I'm sure they had some kind of a horn or some way to communicate quickly to the people guarding the actual gateway behind this entrance. Watch out, there's someone coming on, 100 feet to the left, whatever. And of course, that person would probably disappear and never be seen again. Don't worry about that. Just say they could easily separate the threatening figures in the crowds because of their lookout. So this was well defended. And as far as I know, it was never attacked during the time of ancient Egypt. Now, later on, of course, when the Romans took over, it had already been, I think it was still being used then, but it was abandoned before the Roman Empire fell. And then it fell into ruin, of course. But it's still standing. You'll see, I walk through it. It doesn't have a roof, and most of the walls are missing. But the entrance is there. The obelisk is there. Many more of the statues, besides these few, have been re-erected. And inside, almost all the columns are still there at this point. You can barely see the edge of one. Okay, that's it on the meaning. Formal analysis, completely symmetrical, totally balanced. Same height, same shape. And how about space? Well, it's the entrance to a temple complex where the columns were 60 feet tall and they ran for a mile along the Nile. You don't have to write it that way, but that's how I used to remember things. Just say it was the longest temple complex in ancient Egypt. And it had several rooms, of course. It was divided into many rooms, that, one right after the other. And then these pylons were about 50 feet high. So that's real space. And the obelisk, the tallest object, was about 60 feet. These sculptures are about 20. So those are the dimensions of the real space. There is simulated texture on the sculptures, on the skin and the faces. And there, you see this, the field headdress there again. And then we have the real rough texture of the stonework and all the color. It's all done with sand color stone. I'm not saying it's all sandstone, but the color of sand. So everything here is warm. And of course, there's no technique for modeling. It's the shadows from the sun. Line is carved on the sculpture and on the obelisk. Here, it's visual line at the corners. Is it stable or dynamic? Well, the back or the side, the edges are tapering, all four corners, right? So that's dynamic, but then the individual surfaces are flat. So it's both. The sculptures and the obelisk here are upright. So those would be considered stable elements. Let's see, rhythm, of course, is the repeated shapes of the stonework, the statues themselves, and the individual blocks of stone, you could say, but each of the two pylons are the same exact shape. So there's lots of rhythm. And yeah, I already said it's balanced, right? Okay, so let's move on now to King Tut, where there is a lot of misconceptions about him. First of all, before you start writing about the first must-know, take a look at this. I took this slide when I was with my daughter. This guy was someone who looked like he, I think he was the father of a family that was visiting not from Chicago. This is in Chicago at the museum they call the Oriental Institute. The reason I took this is the tallest statue ever created of King Tut, 18 feet tall, and it was not stolen. This statue was legally purchased by that museum and legally allowed to leave. And you see, it wasn't damaged because the thieves here didn't. But it shows something most people have no idea about Tut unless you study. He had a club foot. One foot was shorter than the other. I think that's this one, actually. Yes, because he had polio when he was a young man. There was no vaccines, right? So when he had polio, he's lucky he didn't, become totally crippled. He literally had to walk with a limp the rest of his life. Okay, now here's when you should start writing about the meaning of the last two must-knows. This is second from the last one on your syllabus tonight, the Throne of Tutankham. Now, Tut is how most people pronounce it, right? But you would need to, of course, it's in front of you on your syllabus. Remember, the tests are both open book, but just if it helps you to remember, so you don't have to necessarily look it up every time if you write about him in either a paper or for extra credit or on the exam. One of these two slides is a high possibility, this or the last one, of being on the midterm. I always break it down into syllables. Tut, right, his nickname, T-U-T, wearing an ankh. I think many of you may even own some, right? Ankhs are still sold in jewelry shops. Something you wear around your neck is a magic talisman. A-N-K-H, Tut, wearing an ankh, A-N-K-H, and then protected by Amun, the god I just remembered, who protected all pharaohs throughout Egypt. A-M-U-N. So Tut, wearing an ankh, protected by Amun, is how his name's spelled. Egypt, 1327 BC. This is his throne, the detail from the back of his throne of himself and his wife. So here are the facts. There's quite a few that are not in dispute, and then we'll talk about the contested facts about him. No one knows exactly how he died or even why. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, these are the facts we know. He was the youngest pharaoh to actually rule. He was 17 when he took the throne. And I don't know if they had any legal age limit for being an adult, but he was allowed to rule in his own name. And he ruled these are all facts. You may know some of these. If you don't, you should be writing these things. He ruled for less than 3 years. And he died sometime around his 20th birthday. Some say before, some say right. So it's about around his 20th birthday. So he only ruled for less than 3 years. Also, he really loved his wife, the queen, of course. There she is. They were childhood sweethearts. It was an arranged marriage, and they don't always end up being happy ones. In fact, maybe more often than not, they're not. And in the ancient, well, actually, all the way through history of kings and queens, there have been arranged marriage. All kinds of, even as recently as now in parts of the world. So theirs may have been arranged, but they genuinely loved each other. I think you can see it in this particular bas-relief. Of course, this is a bas-relief panel. That should be obvious at this point. You've seen several of them, right? It's carved into the back of his throne. 1/3 life size, these figures, right? By the way, about 2 feet high. Not quite 2, because he's seated. So she and he were very affectionate to each other. You see that here. She's actually anointing his shoulder with oil. And there are people who look at this and say, oh, yeah, typical, the man sits down and the woman, serves him in some way, which, that's not the case here. It would be with many other royal couples. But in their marriage, they treated each other with respect and equality. And I'll prove that to you when I show you a fresco of the two of them inside his tomb at the end of this evening. It's conclusive proof that they did things for each other. They really loved and respected each other. She was an important source of advice. She didn't actually have any power. So don't make the mistake of thinking of her as a co-ruler. She wasn't, not like Nefertiti, but she had influence. Okay. And then we see their magnificent ceremonial headdresses here and, you know, their necklaces. That's the throne. It's an image within an image, right? We're looking at the back of it there, of course, here. And this was found inside his tomb, which again, I think everyone knows this, but maybe if you don't, you need to write it. His tomb, Tut's tomb, was the only pharaoh, Egyptian pharaoh's tomb found intact yet. So ever found intact. Of any ancient Egyptian pharaoh, his is the only one ever found intact to this day. There may be others. We may stumble on some. Somebody may find one, you know, with some kind of archaeological dig, but right now, his is the only one. So it's a fortuitous accident that it was found with everything inside intact. His mummy, his funerary mask, we're going to see that as the last must know, his jewelry, his chariot, his weapons, and furniture, and all kinds of other valuable things were found, as was the case inside, of course, all Pharaoh's tombs. But this is, to quote Steve Martin, a condo made of stone. Yeah, that song wouldn't be politically correct anymore. So you may have heard of is the parody about King Tut that came out when Tut's artifacts were still allowed to be touring. They can't leave Egypt anymore. They're too valuable. No insurance company on earth will insure them. So you'd have to go to Cairo to see these things. Anybody here, maybe some of you saw the exhibit that came to San Francisco. I think it was at the De Young, about 3 or 4 years ago. None of these objects were there.
Unfortunately, I saw it in the late 70s, and I was far too young to truly appreciate it.
Yeah, but you got some idea, I think. Right?
Yeah, I did. I went through it faster than I should have.
It came twice. It's strange. It came within 3 years. You don't have to write this. In 82, it came back a second time. I don't even know why that happened, but that's never going to happen again. So this is in a museum in Cairo, and guess what? All the artifacts from his tomb are there. That's no accident. Lord Carter, this part of the meeting I think you should write, because it's not typical. This is 1922, just under 100 years ago. Next year is the anniversary. His tomb was found by a British archaeologist with an international team of over 100 experts, and they were all paid fairly, and they were chosen by their skills. They were Egyptian, of course, some of them, other Americans, other Brits, French, German, I think even other European countries, and 1 or 2 other, perhaps from other parts of Africa. The point is, when they found the tomb intact, obviously he was offered immense money to take the artifacts back to Britain and sell them, or even just to give them to the British Museum. And he said, no, that isn't right. These belong to the people of Egypt, and he donated them to the Egyptian government, which then opened that museum with those artifacts. And it's been a high tourist, well, during the worst of the pandemic, I'm sure the attendance was down, but it's always been a top tourist site, and probably the biggest tourist site after the pyramids themselves in all of Egypt. No small thing. Most archaeologists from Western countries would never have thought twice about taking those objects away. He's a hero. He's a hero. In Egypt, he is greatly admired, and rightly so, because he was way ahead of his time in thinking that way. But because he did that, it got a few other of the more enlightened historians and archaeologists who were exploring, not just in Egypt, but other parts of the world, to start thinking a little bit more, carefully and fairly about other countries' artifacts. But he's the first major one to do that, and to take not to take any of those artifacts out. Now, there's the myths about him, about Tut, not about Lord Carter. One of which I think a lot of people think they know how he died. So that's really the main one I'm going to ask. Has anybody heard how he died? There's several theories, and new ones keep coming up all the time. Anybody heard anything? How did he die so young? Obviously, it wasn't normal for someone barely 20, even in ancient Egypt, to die.
Hot tubbing accident.
Nope, not that one. Okay. Anybody hear any more mainstream theories about how he died?
I thought I heard that he got like a cut and it got infected, something like that.
An infection. We can keep it as a broad category. It could even have been malaria. That's what one of the main Egyptian historians thinks he's found evidence. but there's no way to know for sure. We have his mummy, but of course, you know, germs or bacteria aren't going to survive. The DNA does, right? To some, well, does it that far? Yeah, I think it does. But we don't know. We know he had polio, but that doesn't necessarily mean he had, you know, any other kind of infection. But he could have had an infection, and it could even have been from possibly an injury. But if there was, it was probably more likely a tropical disease. There were plenty of those in Egypt, of course. There still are. Okay, what's another theory? Anybody else? Well, all right. He was murdered. And that theory has some credence, but no evidence. All we know is this. He died under mysterious circumstances. There is a hole in the back of his skull, the mummy actually itself as a whole. Of course, it's, you know, the back of the actual skeleton, mummified. So how did that hole get there? Well, that leads to more theories, which is he fell in the royal palace, hit his head because he was club-footed, and he might have had too much, you know, fermented Nile juice or whatever. That's what some people say. It could be. Or he could just have fallen because obviously he was limping. He didn't walk normally. We already covered that. There's no mystery to that. So he could have died of an accidental blow to the head, and that's where the hole could have come from. Another theory is he was murdered from a blow from behind. And the only evidence to back that up is his successor was his top minister who coveted the throne and his wife. And guess what? As soon as Tut died and the funeral was over, he got both. He got the throne and he forced Tut's widow to marry him. So he had motive, he had opportunity, but we don't have the murder weapon or any other evidence. So no one can prove it. The third theory about the hole in the back of his skull is it was an accident that happened during mummification, but that one makes me laugh. If you were so incompetent, you're a royal mummifier, right? On the team of, they had teams of people, of course, not just one or two. And your whole job, your whole reason for, you know, being is to mummify the pharaoh and any members of his family when they die. And you're so careless that you put a hole in the back of the skull. Well, you aren't going to live. You're going to be dead within minutes. You're going to be executed, probably tortured to death, thrown to the ants or the crocodiles, whatever. I mean, that just doesn't stand to reason. It makes no sense. They wouldn't have been that careless. So I don't know. No one knows. But the idea of him dying of an accidental blow from, you know, tripping, you know, falling in the palace, or, well, probably would have been the palace where people would have seen it happen if it was outside. Or from an infection. Those two theories make the most sense to me, but no one can prove it. Then the final one, I'll end with this, and we'll do a formal analysis on this slide, is totally specious, completely ridiculous. The curse of King Tut's tomb. Have you heard? Anybody heard that one? All these people out of the 100 plus, it was like 120 people that went into the tomb. Many of them died within a few years of mysterious, unnatural deaths. Well, yes and no, mostly no, because out of that size group of people, a half a dozen, I think, died within the next 5 years. It might even been 8 or 10. That's statistically normal for a group of people that are adults. And, you know, at a time when people didn't live, we're talking about 100 years ago, there was almost no medicine, no vaccine. Well, maybe there was a primitive form of vaccine, but not for all the diseases you could catch in Egypt. So yeah, some of the explorers on that team, one or two went back to England. One died in a motorcycle accident. Okay, an accident. What, that proves it was King Tut's ghost, you know? And one died from food poisoning. Again, can happen. It was much more common back in the 1920s before refrigeration was.
I thought I heard a theory that there might have been like lots of other, like, you know, viruses and bugs and stuff that were unknown to people at that time. Their bodies weren't prepared for it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. If you're talking about Tut's death now, or the people on the...
No, the people who, the cursed people.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe. I haven't read enough to know. I just know that the ones I have read about, they don't stand up to any kind of, you know, specious claim of supernatural powers. People died of accidents and infections. It happened, especially even more common back then. And so out of 100 and some people, you know, 4 or 5, maybe 6 of them died within 5 years. It doesn't prove anything. Okay, let's do the formal analysis. He's the largest mass, though he's seated, so it means it's balanced. You see, their heads are almost exactly the same level because he's seated, but of course he'd be taller if he stood up. The only technique for space is overlapping. There's not even foreshortening here. And remember, that's not a register line. One line does not a register line make. You have to have two or more. So it's just overlapping of their, bodies, and there's clothes over them bodies. Okay, and then we have the rhythm of the arms and hands, feet, right, legs, heads, headdresses, clothing, lots of rhythm. Stable. It's almost entirely stable. Look carefully. She's standing upright. He's seated at a right angle, and even his arms are more, and hers are almost totally horizontal. So it's mostly stable with some dynamic detail, of course, in the headdresses and the necklaces. Because there's the throne, it's mostly stable too. But you do have really good symmetric texture here on the skin, the jewelry, the clothing. That's done with carved and inlaid. There's no painted line here. It's inlaid precious stonework of different kinds. I forget what they're all, I think that might be garnet, or I'm not sure. Anyway, it's precious stones that are inlaid here. I know on the head, the blue parts, what looks gold is gold. That is painted. I should say there is paint on the background, but on their figures, the symmetric textures are done with inlay. That's literally the only way to write it. And carved line for the details, the eyes, the hands, and the clothing. The rhythm I already mentioned. Oh yeah, let's see, balance, space. Oh, warm. Yeah, warm skin tones, of course. They were North African, pre-Arabic. And cool on their clothing and their headdress, and warm on the gold background. Let's see, balance, rhythm, modeling, of course, is the lighting from now the museum, but it would have been no modeling inside the tomb, obviously, but, of course, before it was locked up inside the tomb with his body, that would have been, from the sun during his funeral, of course, that this was on display. Before they buried it. The funerals lasted like days and days back then. Weeks, actually, some of the pharaohs. He was very popular, by the way. Oh, one last thing. We're going to move on here. Anybody think of a parallel with recent American history, or recent to me, within my lifetime, of a ruling American couple where the wife was very popular and she spoke multiple languages? Oh, I forgot to say, they toured all the time. They toured and they got crowds cheering them wherever they went, all over the empire, the Egyptian empire. And he was, I'm giving you some hints here, the youngest ruler in Egyptian history. So was this American ruler I'm thinking of. And he only lasted 3 years. That should be a strong clue. And died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Oh, certainly in the case of the American ruler, I'm talking about violently. Okay, anybody know who I'm talking about? The Egyptians themselves say that that's a parallel with one of our earlier American rulers. Anybody think who I'm talking about? No.
Lincoln.
Lincoln, yes. Lincoln. No, not Lincoln. I said Lincoln. No. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy ruled for barely 3 years. He was our youngest president. He was the most popular in modern times. His funeral went on for days. It took a long time to deal with that. The whole country was in mourning, as bad as after 9/11. It's the only other incident that's a parallel to how much, many of you remember 9/11, and then it was more concentrated because it was one family with the loss of a father, husband, president of the whole country, of course. He had a few enemies, but most people didn't want to see him die. And of course it was a violent death. But the difference being Johnson didn't force Jackie Kennedy to marry him. Okay, right. So that's where the parallel ends. No, they say that in Egypt. They'll tell you that. He was our Kennedy. They say things like that about our history because they know American history better than most Americans know. And they find the parallels interesting. I'll prove that point too with my own slides. We're going to do one more must know. That is his coffin. It's not a must know, but look how magnificent it is. Yes, what is gold looks like gold is gold. And that's the stone that you're going to hear the last now. Lapis lazuli. So here we go. The last must know for tonight. And then I'll show you my own slides of a trip down the Nile. This is a funerary mask of Tutankhamun. Funerary is Funerary. mask, of course, you all know everyone has to wear one in public, in indoor spaces. I've already spelled Tut, so I'm just going to say Tutankhamun, Egypt, of course, 1327 BC. The throne was 1329. I might have mixed those dates up, but it's right on the syllabus. You see that they're only 2 years apart. The throne was made sometime after he took the throne, so within a few months. So you see how he didn't even rule 3 years, you know, and that's what the parallel with Kennedy comes in. Kennedy only was on in the White House for 2 years and 9 months. Okay, so what do we see here? This is the funerary mask, and there's a very short definition. Your last one, only 2 for tonight, in fact, and that's on their list of terms to know, and that is funerary, F-U-N-E-R-E-A-Y, of course, is something from or having to do with funerals, or art. Sorry, I meant art, not just something. Art that has something to do with or is from a funeral. Sorry, funerary applies to single objects, you know, from a funeral. I'll say it again. Art that is either from or has to do with a funeral. Well, of course, that's a funerary piece. The title tells us it went over his mummy. I think most of you know this, right? That he was encased in layer after layer. That's how they did these things. First, there's the wrapping of the mummy, several layers, of course, of bandages. Then that mask is put over his mummy. That's what this was, to cover. Done from a death. Right after he died, a wax impression was made. That's called death mask. We know this is what he looked like. We don't have to guess. Then that is put inside the coffin, which is what this is, of course. And then if that's not enough, the whole thing was put inside the sarcophagus. And I have a really nice close-up slide of what his sarcophagus looked like. It's pretty fancy and it's huge. So he was literally given layer after layer of covering to protect him for the voyage to the next life. That's why they did that. And then somewhat from grave robbers, because, you know, most of those other tombs in the Valley of the Kings, his is the only one that wasn't robbed. Why it wasn't found, no one knows. Okay, then we have the symbols on his ceremonial headdress. This is a major part of the meaning. I said earlier that Pharaoh could turn themselves into several types of animals because they were minor gods, sacred animals that were symbolic of the Pharaoh's power. One was a cobra and another was a vulture. Well, here's a vulture-headed snake. So sometimes just a straight vulture, sometimes a snake with a vulture's head, other times just a cobra, and then we know a falcon. Those were the main animals, vulture, snake, or falcon that Pharaoh could turn himself into. So that's why they had them on their headdress. And that's, yes, this is ivory, inlaid ivory. Look how magnificent that is. I think it should be fairly evident that he had some sub-Saharan Black African heritage, which came from his mother's side in his genetic makeup. The beard is fake. He was too young to grow a beard. Well, I don't know, maybe he should have been able to by 19 and a half, but he had only a stubble. I mean, that's well documented. There are images of him from when he was alive. So they had to give him a longer beard to make him look more important. And so that's not accurate, but obviously part of the image they want to convey. And last but not least, we have the classic Egyptian use, gold and blue over and over. And the gold is what it looks like. The blue is lapis lazuli, one of the most precious stones in ancient Egypt. And it's a color scheme that's used all over the world today in flags and emblems, as well as the UC Berkeley colors. If you go to UC Berkeley, I have friends who do, you'll see what I mean. Blue and gold, right? The blue is a precious stone. Lapis, 2 words, like it sounds, L-A-P-I-S, lazula, L-A-Z-U-L-A. Okay, that's pretty much the whole meaning. Now we'll do the formal analysis. It's balanced, left to right, totally symmetrical, of course. It's an intact human face and headdress. The rhythm is powerful on the headdress especially, but also his face, his eyes, his eyebrows. And that's done with inlay, or the simulated textures, I'm sorry, super sharp and realistic, but there's the real texture. So it's both of the gold, right? And then the ivory. That then is inlaid, as is the headdress, the blue stone. But the rest of the textures are done with carved line on his nose, his lips, his ears, of course. And then he is almost entirely stable. His headdress may be dynamic at the top, but look carefully. These are all straight lines. He is looking straight at us. I actually have another view of it. I think I have two views. That one seems stylized. I'm not sure. That may be the original piece. It's been so long since I saw it. But this one, I think, is actually accurate. But the lighting, I think, is most accurate on this one. It's how I remember seeing it through the glass case. People literally almost, you think I'm exaggerating, but I saw people get quivering shakes when they saw this. And even one or two of them, short of breath at how magnificent this piece is. Literally priceless. You can't put a price on it. Okay, so then we have the colors are cool on the blue and, of course, warm on the gold, and neutral on the black and white around the eyes and the eyebrows. Let's see. Texture, yeah, smooth, real texture of skin. I guess I didn't quite finish that. Fake beard texture down here. And the lips have texture, I would say, and so does the headdress. Good cement texture, but plus the real textures of the smooth stones, the gold and the lapis lazuli. The modeling, there is no technique for modeling. For space, it's a hollow wooden, of course, the gold's over wood. That should be obvious, not solid gold. And that's put over his face and his chest, the top half of his mummy. So it's a hollow piece, life size, with only overlapping of the headdress. And I guess you could say the two animals over the top of the headdress. And let's see, balance. So the largest mass, I guess it's a headdress if you break it down that way. And then his head or his face and neck. And I guess the beard, if you want to break it down, is a separate piece because it was. Okay, am I forgetting anything? I think I've covered that. The colors, yeah. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Stop share. This will take, 90, shouldn't be more than 90 seconds. I'm going to go pull up my own slides of my trip to Egypt. I think you'll find it more than mildly interesting, and you can ask any questions you want, but it's not a place most Americans ever go to anymore because it's supposedly not safe. But when I was there, it was beyond safe. It was probably one of the safest places I ever went to, except for the water, which of course, some of you may already know. Water in places such as Egypt is not really safe to drink for Westerners, certainly most Americans, because of the bacteria in it. Don't drink the water is more than a cliche. It literally could mean the difference between you're getting sick or not. Well, I unfortunately didn't drink the water. I'm not foolish, but I ate some salad in one of the hotels in Cairo, my first day there. And they probably washed the salad in Nile River water. So I got Ramses' revenge. They actually call it that when foreigners get sick. And I'm going to tell you, you don't want that to ever happen to you because it was worse than a similar thing in Mexico, Montezuma's revenge, right? Which I also got in Mexico City on a much later trip. This was in the 80s when, hey, it's been a dictatorship in that country for almost before I was born, certainly pretty much. They had one elected official, you may know that. He was overthrown by the current dictator. So everything was under tight control. There was no crime anywhere. I left my camera in a tea shop, and the next day, not only was it there, but the proprietor had it behind the counter, and he didn't even want to accept a thank you gesture of, $10 or $20, I think it was. I insisted. They were scrupulously honest. Everyone I met there, I can't speak too highly of how friendly the people were when they knew we were Americans. I was traveling with two other teachers, me and two teachers, the three of us from Skyline High School in Oakland. I was a high school teacher at that time. And we were welcomed everywhere. So this is the view from the hotel. And here are people lined up around an open sewer. The city of Cairo is 18 million plus. I think it might be pushing 20 million now. One of the largest cities in the world. And it has a really badly deteriorating infrastructure. Hopefully you guys can see these, right? And unfortunately, that will show in some of my pictures. Now, this is the nice neighborhood. You probably tell they're actual trees, right? And grass. This is the palace. I think it's the presidential palace. And then there's a building for the Congress. And then, of course, that's all just show. The real power is with the dictator and the army. But look at all the minarets. Of course, it's a Muslim city, not entirely. Over 2 million people in Cairo are Christian. It's more than 10% left over from when they were part of the Roman Empire and the Byzantines who came after the Romans. We'll talk about them both, of course, when they had become a Christian empire, and until the Muslim, Muhammad, of course, and his armies took over Egypt. So there's still about 10 million in the entire country of Egypt, about 10 million Christians. So let's go take a look at this here. This is the City of the Dead, they call it, right at the foot of the oldest mosque. That's the first mosque built in Cairo. Cairo's not an ancient city. It was started in the Middle Ages, around like 700 AD, which would have been the dark ages in Europe, right? Down at the foot of this really old mosque, it's the real thing, not a replica reconstructed, is a cemetery where back then the homeless population was already burgeoning. I understand it's much worse now. People arrive by the thousands every day with no job and nowhere to stay. That happens in many parts of the world. And so some of them are told to go to the City of the Dead. That means all the way across town to the base of this. It's a fortress, a citadel, right? Which is why they put the first mosque there. And at the base of it is a cemetery where the gates are gone or they're torn down, something. Anyway, you can walk around freely. And the crypts have been taken over by families. They sleep in the same spot that some of the dead bodies occupied just days or weeks earlier. And yeah, I saw some of those bodies. There were skeletons lying on the ground next to the people cooking their dinner. But if that's your only choice other than living on the street, I totally would understand that. Okay, you can see the streets aren't well maintained. In parts of the city, they are, as you could guess, the wealthier districts and the government quarter. But they do have their soccer moms, a few. I think it's less than 10%, maybe it's up to 15%, if that, of Cairo only, not the whole country of Egypt, is not poor, is middle class or upper class. So it's way more like 80 or more than 80% poverty, the population there. But like I said, I didn't see any crime anywhere I went. This is noon prayer. I'm going to go quickly to get us to the pyramids here. At noon, 1 of 5 times a day, as some of you know, when Muslims are supposed to stop whatever they're doing, wherever they are, unless they're in the middle of an operation in a hospital, which they would time to not be, or driving a bus or something like that, or a train, then they wouldn't. But if they weren't doing some essential task, they're supposed to stop and pray. And this guy had just finished praying. The noon prayer had just ended. And he was in the middle of the street saying his prayers for, 10 or 15 minutes. And all the cars just waited. The bus and the cars just stopped. Because that's what their religion teaches the devout to do. And here's a mosque and a Christian church, the proof of what I said. They actually got along for a long time, and now they still mostly do. But, as I said earlier tonight, every culture, every country, every society has their nutcases, their crazies who hate people that are different. And that's unfortunately a minority in Egypt that want to get rid of the Christians. They can't, there are too many of them. And the government is definitely willing to try and protect their churches, the Christian churches. So these two congregations have been side by side the buildings are easily 100 years old. And look, there's 7 Up in Arabic. Okay, so let's go. Oh yeah, this one's worth it. Donald Duck, you see him there, right? What's he doing? Well, here's Mustafa Kemal, who was a hero of theirs. In the 1920s, he almost got freedom, independence for Egypt before any other country in Africa had, because he rebelled against the British colonial rule. And the Brits respect him so much, they didn't execute him. They tried him, and I think he went to prison for a little while, but then they let him out. And so he's a hero. And that's a statue of him. And it looks like he's pointing here to Donald Duck. This was an afternoon matinee for the small middle class segment of Cairo that can afford it, but it was dubbed over in Arabic. If you've ever, I know everyone probably who's ever watched any Disney cartoons has heard Donald Duck's voice. It's already at a kind of a scratchy pitch, isn't it? Dub it over in Arabic. It's excruciating. Okay. When I walked by there, I had to put my hands over my ears. That's the Nile. A good mile wide, at least. In some places, it's more like a mile and a half. And these people are, fishermen who go out. And of course, they don't, you see, they're traditional 100 plus, maybe 150-year-old boats, some of them, passed down from father to son. they don't get sick. But I got, when I said Ramses' Revenge, my experience was 5 days. I couldn't eat normally until the 4th day. I lost 22 pounds in the first 4 days, and I was not overweight to begin with. I was in my late 20s, early 30s. It was scary. You can die from it. If it gets bad enough, the dehydration can kill you. So I was lucky. Medical care then and now, I believe, was free. Foreigner, citizen, didn't matter. I went to a kiosk. Yeah, you know what those are, where they used to sell newspapers. And the medical profession is on the streets there, as well as in hospitals, of course, and for clinics for the wealthy part. But any person can just walk up to a kiosk and find an actual doctor. And luckily I found one who spoke English, and he knew right away what it was. And he told me, oh, you got Ramses' Revenge. Here, take 1 pill each day for 5 days. Drink water the first day, and then you can add a little bit of rice the third. Yeah, I got over it in 5 days, but it was a scary experience. Unfinished skyscrapers all over the skyline of Cairo. And these are still there, the same ones. I had a friend who went there, well, like 3 or 4 years ago, and took a photo of this same set of buildings. Whoever took the money ran. In other words, the developer just was a scam artist, and they left this unfinished set of condos. Maybe someday they'll be finished. Now, here's an object lesson for everyone traveling in a foreign country. Most of you who have had some experience like this. If you haven't, just, you know, I'm sure you wouldn't dispute this. You know the old saying, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. In a foreign culture, the opposite is true. Don't try that other reverse philosophy. It might work in the US for Americans traveling in our own country, or whatever, within your family or friends. Not there. I didn't ask permission. I took this picture. That's an Egyptian army base, and that's I wanted a picture of this. The sentry box is a work of art. It's 500 years old. It's Turkish. When the Turks occupied Egypt, they built these all over the big cities. But that's an Egyptian soldier carrying, of course, a semi-automatic rifle that was bought from the US Army. And he was PO'd. He walked up to me. He grabbed my camera. He started shouting at me in Arabic. He grabbed my arm. I thought I was going to get arrested and maybe never get out of whatever military prison is in this building. I was scared to death. I was lucky. A professor came along, dressed more in Western style. So I thought he might speak English, and luckily he did. He was Egyptian, but he spoke English. And he heard me explain what I was doing. He talked to the soldier. The soldier calmed down, gave me my camera back, obviously, or you couldn't see this picture. But I learned my lesson. I never did that again, not just in Egypt, but any other country. If you don't know if it's breaking a rule to do a certain photo, ask, or any other thing that you as a visitor might think of. The other idea of better to ask, for forgiveness, it does not apply. This is a mosque that was one of the oldest in Cairo. It's about 600 years old. And there's the minaret. Yes, people still climb up there to do the prayer. When we get to the pyramids, there are about 5 more slides. This is an example. The next day after I had the incident with the soldier, when I went to this mosque, I asked for permission. Actually, this is the interior of that mosque we just saw. It's 600 years old. Even the stained glass it's beautiful, isn't it? This was the imam. And he came to the door and he spoke enough English to understand that I was an American. And I said, sir, I don't want to, do anything that's not appropriate. Is it okay if I take a picture of the inside of the building when no one's looking? He said, if you wait till, and you can see, that's what I did. Till everyone's face is turned, it's all right. So again, always ask permission. Okay, let's go out to the Great Pyramids. And you will see. What you'll find when you get there is that the city of Cairo has grown. I mean, this is 35, 40 years ago, somewhere in the 37 years ago, in the early 80s. Now, I've heard from people who've been there recently, the developments are so close to the edge of the pyramids, but they do have a zone where they aren't allowed to. So I think this road, for instance, is the boundary where developers cannot keep building. It looks closer than it is. That's the Great Pyramid, the one of Khufu that we talked about, the 480-foot tall one, now 460-foot tall. And these, of course, are camel jockeys who will be happy to give you a ride. Back then, it was $5 or $10 for a half-hour ride. No. Camels and me don't mix. I tried to ride one once in another part of the Middle East. They are nasty creatures. They smell, they bite, they kick, they can take off with you on their back and not come back until they're ready. It didn't need to do that. So I just thanked them and kept moving on because I was planning to go inside, and that's what I'll tell you what happened. That arrow is pointing to the actual entrance. There's a fake tunnel that misleads or tried to be was designed, I mean, to be a misleading, entry for future potential grave robbers. But if you know where you're going, you can actually get into the tunnel. It's barely 4.5 feet high. And so unless you're, 8 or 9 years old, you can't stand up in that. You have to crawl on your hands and knees. And it's a long tunnel. It goes all the way up and then down. So it has a slight incline and then a decline, and then it reaches the bottom level of this giant mountain of stone. And the room is huge. It's as big as the lecture hall at Annalee Hall. When I'm in that classroom, I just help me look around. That's how big, some of you've been in 708 Annalee Hall, right? It's a good sized room. And it's lit by 40-watt bulbs, at least when I was there, which is very dim form. So I didn't get any photos. I took some, they didn't come out. All that's in there are hieroglyphics and his sarcophagus, which is bashed in one corner. So they stole the mummy and whatever was on the mummy long ago, and some canopic jars, which once held his guts, right? They put the brains and guts in these jars that were supposed to go with him to the next life. Somehow those were left inside the tomb. They're still there. So there isn't a lot to see, but it's worth the experience. Unless, let's go to the next view. You're unfortunate to be behind someone who's claustrophobic. Now, why would anyone go inside a small, narrow, dark, dimly lit space if they're claustrophobic? Well, some German tourist couple was ahead of me. I speak German, so I understood what they were saying. I said, oh, no, please don't. The wife started getting panicky about halfway through the tunnel. So about the middle of it, we're good. It took like 15 minutes. So we're 7 or 8 minutes into this crawling slowly, dozens of people behind each other. Suddenly she starts screaming and she says, let me out in German, of course. And she started crawling backwards. So everyone behind her, me and my 2 other teacher friends, all of us, had to crawl backwards all the way to the exit. And they had an ambulance waiting for her here when she got out. And I just thought, why would you do that if you know that you're claustrophobic? Well, I guess you just wanted the experience. And in the end, it was too consumed. So if you have any fear of tight, small, enclosed places, don't go inside the Great Pyramid. You see how the stones are. I climbed up about this high, and it was 120 degrees and no shade. And I was still suffering from that Ramses revenge, so I didn't have much of my strength. So I just stopped about that far. But a lot of people have gone all the way to the top. You can see it's pretty impressive. So now let's take a boat down the Nile, and just for a few minutes, in a few minutes, like 3 minutes, we'll get into King Tut's tomb. But I just wanted you to see there are 5 ways to go from northern Egypt, like Cairo and that area where the pyramids are, down to the Valley of the Kings, which is in Luxor. It's about 400 miles. You can fly. We actually did fly one way, but when we got to the airport, we found out Luxor was still a ways down. So we took a boat the last part of the way. So there's a boat, there's a train, there's a bus, there's a plane, and there's rental cars. It's much faster, more comfortable to fly, but of course it's expensive. So on the way back, we took a bus all the way up the Sinai Desert. Well, I think it's the Sinai. Yeah, no, it's not the Sinai there. It's the Egyptian desert and across the Sinai into Israel. That took almost 2 days, because it stopped in every little town, but it got really interesting to see. But this was just before we spent the night in the town of Luxor, because we got there, it was almost dark, you could tell. So we got up, according to the guides, they say, do not go into the Valley of the Kings after about 10 a.m. and you will fry, you will bake, especially if you're from the West and you're not used to these kind of temperatures. 122 degrees by the time we got there. No shade. These are tailings. You see these? From all the tombs that have been excavated over the centuries by previous either grave robbers or actual explorers. So we had a guide, luckily, spoke very good English, was educated in England, actually. And he was, a godsend, because he told us all these things we wouldn't have known. You can see it's desert mountain range. It's the Valley of the Kings. And in these hills are the empty tombs of, I think it's over 24 pharaohs, where nothing was inside by the time modern explorers came and until you get to the entrance. This is the entrance looking out from inside the entrance of King Tut's tomb. And this set of stairs has been constructed because it would be hard to climb up this hill for most people, unless they're experienced, or just really good hikers in the heat, especially. What happened when he found it, Lord Carter, he knew he was in the right place, but he also deferred to the advice of the locals, the Egyptians, about how much dynamite to use, because there's no way, if they just started blasting or chiseling their way in, they could have caused a mountain slide, right? And that could have buried it for a long time, if not killed some of their crew. Another extreme would have been to use just dynamite, but too much, and you destroy everything inside. So he had to have just the right amount. So he had engineers with him, both Egyptian and foreign engineers, and they figured out just the right amount. Nothing was damaged. So here's what you see when you go inside. There is Tut and his wife, and you'll see him on another fresco anointing her, just as you saw her doing for him, remember, on the back of the throne. Now, this is in low light. You got to realize that. No tripod, no flasher allowed. So these turned out pretty good considering that. Here's the sarcophagus. Now, that's Anubis. I think somebody mentioned him before. The jackal-headed god of the underworld who greets you when your spirit crosses the river into the next life. And then these are images of him as a young man. And this hieroglyphics are, of course, their language. Describe something about him and what the gods of the underworld would need to know. Look how big that sarcophagus is. It's about 8 feet long. Well, you can probably just tell by looking, but it's huge. He was fairly tall. He was right around 6'1", 6'2", something like that. But of course, they had to have room for his coffin and the funerary mask. And here is the proof I was telling you earlier. He's also anointing her while she does that for him, the two of them, equally affectionate and respectful. They really did love each other. It's very impressive to see these frescoes on the wall of this 3,300-year-old tomb. And here's some of the servants that are in another part of the tomb. They were not buried with, that's another myth. Maybe a few if they wanted to be, but that probably was extremely rare. But if they died before, and in their will, and they were favored servants of the Pharaoh or Pharaoh's family, his wife, or maybe their bodies were mummified and kept until it was time, or even put in the future tomb before he died. That could have happened, but they weren't executed. All the servants weren't slaughtered and then forced to be buried inside the tomb. But that's them in the next life. So if they did have their mummies with his, they could then be reborn into a new existence in the afterlife, but of course they'd still be servants. Now this is the ceiling above his sarcophagus, and here's a symbol of Taurus, and here's Leo, so I'm not sure which one he was, and here's the skateboarding god. I shouldn't say that, but he looks like he's skateboarding to me. That would be one of the other gods, Horus. That's the other one, Horus. Yeah, and then there's the two I find fascinating, the hippopotamus god and the crocodile god. They both had powers over certain things on earth having to do with the Nile, but I don't remember the details. And then here we have some of the other spirits, that perhaps his ancestors even, that would have greeted him once he crossed, I think he was supposed to cross a river into the next life. Okay, so I'm only going to show you a few more slides because, okay, I have to be careful how I describe this one. This is another tomb, different tomb. This isn't their tomb. Tut or his wife. His wife wasn't buried with him. I'm not sure where she was buried. Probably in the same tomb as the guy that forced her to marry him, his successor. But look at this. She's literally giving birth to quite a few children. They're coming literally one after the other right out of her body. And that's her husband. And maybe without my getting graphic, you can see why they were so fertile as a couple. Part of the reason is his anatomy, of course. They weren't hung up about things like that, of course, in ancient Egypt, or most ancient cultures, depicting the full view of certain body parts. And here's another pharaoh's tomb. And this is where the vulture, right? And here's the sun god is a disc, but sometimes it was portrayed with wings. And these are, of course, two snake heads. It could be portrayed several different ways. Ra, right, the sun god, or a 10. The vulture is, again, another symbol for the pharaoh himself when he chose to convert himself. And here we have you see what I mean about the temple of Hatshepsut. This is how it looked when I was there many years ago. And there she is. Let's get a close-up of her, because when you get up close, you can see the stylizing of their art. Her face wasn't that wide, but it probably was unusually featured. There's evidence for that. I think her mummy's been found, but I'm not sure. In any case, there's pictures, actual drawings. I mean, here she is as a falcon wearing the field headdress that pharaohs could wear. And there's a 10, the sun god Ra. And here are the cow gods that were some of her patron gods or goddess, I can't remember, probably goddesses, that she would worship too. And she was, like I said, very popular. And let's see, how are we doing on time? It's only 9:20. We'll do about 5. I think there's only about 5 or 6 more slides. There's the Nile River Valley. You can see how green it is. You get less than a mile from the river, desert. And this is a temple built next to hers, right next to it, adjacent to Hatshepsut, that Alexander the Great built. And when he came to Egypt, I think I've mentioned this. No, it was in the in-person class last week. Think of it this way. He came to Egypt when the pyramids, the Great Pyramids, were 2,300 years old already by the time he came. And his reign was 2,300 years ago before our time, which means that to him, the pyramids were as far in the past as his era is to us today. So, or another way is to say the pyramids are twice as old as ancient Greek culture is. Let's see. Oh, these got damaged. There's the housing she had built. I don't know why those two degraded, those last two images, but that's what we don't. I just want to show you a handful more. These are the housing. I know you might think, oh, it looks grim, but these are people who wouldn't have had any kind of permanent housing without that. And they had a job, I think I told you this, to work on not just her temple, but other buildings in Luxor, because it was considered the second holiest city after the capital, Memphis, where the pharaohs usually resided. And so she would have had a lot of projects during her 20-year reign. And the workers were paid better by her than previous pharaohs. She was quite popular with. And then we'll go through a couple of tombs quickly. This is another pharaoh being, there he is, the jackal-headed god, right, being prepared for the next life. And then this is the modern housing. This is grim. No electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing, nothing. And then and these are previous pharaohs, and they think they know who they are, but we'll end up with Karnak. Yeah, I did say I'd show you Karnak, and that'll be our last thing. This is what there is left of it. There's the pylons we saw, and here's the actual, see, there are obelisks inside as well as separate statues and sculptures and frescoes. What's left of a few frescoes. The roof is missing and most of the outer walls. But walking along these 60-foot tall columns is pretty impressive. Almost all the columns are standing upright. And like I said, they do run for a mile along the Nile. And having walked that whole mile in the hot weather, I can attest to that fact. It's a rather impressive scale. Okay. Some of these well, at least you got to see the ones I wanted to show you. Okay, so that's it. I think I'm going to now do the stop share. And stick around if you have any questions. I hope you enjoyed that about your papers or what we just covered with ancient Egypt or extra credit. Now is a good time to ask. Anybody have any questions? These are, again, as I say, this is my part of my informal office hours. Of course, I don't have really set office hours like when everyone was teaching in person, or most people were. But I will, of course, make time if you need to consult with me by phone. Most people never do that, but I gave you guys my voicemail numbers. The one to call is the.
I do have one question.
Sure.
I got him in here like 20 minutes late.
Okay.
Did you already assign the papers?
Papers are due 2 weeks from tonight. And those are whatever you want to write about, any art, any style, any artist, any period.
Okay.
They're not be from syllabus, except your own. And did you get the handout? If you didn't, you need to email me and I can send it to you tomorrow. It'll be too late tonight. Which is the 5 requirements for your papers. Did you get that? Because I sent it to everybody about.
Yeah, I believe
Good.
I got it some time
And
ago.
you'll get the cover sheet too. That's probably part of what you missed. And everyone
Yeah.
does that, which is a good thing
Great.
to look at while you're putting your paper together. And it's like an outline of what should be included, as well as those 5 requirements. If you have those 2 things next to you, you should be able to get everything you need into the paper. But of course, as like I said, you can either email me with any questions anytime, but don't wait till the night before the paper's due. Or you could even send me a sample of part of the paper, or even maybe a first draft, as long as, again, you give me at least 48 hours before the due date, and I can tell you if you're missing anything.
Okay,
2 weeks,
thanks so
but
much.
you should have picked the topic. And certainly if you haven't, you want to do that right away and start researching. Okay. Any other questions about the paper or about extra credit or anything else relating to what we've covered tonight? Anybody?
I also had a question, but it's more of like a personal one. Is it okay if I wait after class?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Usually I get 2 or 3 questions in addition to the final one is always by someone who prefers to do it at the end. That's fine with me. That works. But does anybody have any other question that's more general that you don't mind asking while there's still 15 or so of your fellow students with us? Anybody else?
No, I don't. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. All right. But I'm just giving you guys that extra time if you want to, because if there is anybody else with a general question or one they want to just ask now, then I'll go to the person who just started to ask me about a personal question. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's about the paper. I've come up with like a couple of actual ideas for it, but I just wanted to run one through you.
Sure, go ahead.
Because there was one. It was
You mean by me? If you run it through me, go to the hospital. I'm kidding.
It was a little painting that was accompanied by a music video. If it's okay that I use that one.
Well, the painting is what you would write about. The video itself, yeah, you could write about that if it's part of the meaning of the. You're talking about. You do need to have an image I can look at, a still image for me to.
Yeah,
see if you analyze the elements of composition. So if you can do that, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Like
it's actually 2 images. That was my other question, because
yeah, you could do
it's
that.
kind of like a part 1 and a part 2.
Well, then that if you have the time, yes, and if they're related to each other and the meaning isn't clear without both halves, then you should do that.
Yeah,
but
the
don't
meaning
forget
is
you
kind
should
of
do a
both.
formal analysis of the elements. Well, I guess you could just do that on one of the 2 images. The composition of the 9 elements that handout. You should have that, right?
Yeah. So the paper is just writing about that for like the main piece of work.
For a page of what you found, and don't forget you have to find 3 sources. So I'm not sure where you find the research, but I'm sure you figured that out and put those in your bibliography. And don't forget to either put endnotes or footnotes in the text from 3 of the facts at least, or 2. Sorry, I meant 2 of the sources in your bibliography. If you're quoting something or you're using a fact that you don't already know, you should have either a footnote, like traditional footnote. I mentioned this before, but I don't know if you caught that about 2 weeks ago. We went over how to write the paper, right? Or in-text citation, and I've explained that pretty well, I think. And the handout gives you samples of the handout of 5 requirements for the paper, how to do that.
Okay.
All right. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it really did. Thank you very much.
Good. Yeah.
All right, have a good one.
Good luck on your paper, and let me know if you have any other questions. Okay. Right, anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question real quick. I joined the class the day before we actually started, and I've been getting most of the emails. I'm pretty sure I have everything, but I don't have the syllabus or the paper. I've just been taking notes on my notebook.
Oh, well, that could work, but did you mention it? Because I've always responded within, well, it depends on when I see them. I check my email about 5 days a week. There are some.
Yeah, also, I wanted to mention that if you got in my bio, I sent it to your school email.
What is your name?
Carlos Castillo. I sent it to your school email.
I'm pretty sure I did not drop you. I'm pretty sure. I'm going to double check. I did accidentally drop someone who didn't send their bio in from this class, but they told me, and I know they'll get reinstated right away by tomorrow. I just found that out, but that was somebody else whose name isn't even close to yours. I don't think I dropped you. Yeah, well, I didn't, because you couldn't see this video you couldn't have logged on if you'd been dropped. So the only thing I can think of is, I guess you just didn't think to mention it earlier, or forgot.
Yeah. I'll just send you.
I can forward to you the syllabus or any other handout that you don't have, but I think I've listed them already, which is, of course, the handout, the terms to know. I mean, sorry, the syllabus, the terms to know, right? The 5 requirements for your paper, and the 9 elements of composition are the main ones you should have.
Yeah, I'll send you another email just to remind you.
Just stipulate which ones you don't have. You got some of the handouts.
I have most of them. I have the 9 compositions, and then I got in your email on the
syllabus
example.
is pretty important for you to study, and
I just wanted to
forward it to you tomorrow.
Okay, so I'll send you an email to remind you.
Mark W at AOL. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Have a good night.
Any other questions? All right. See you guys on Wednesday from my office in Santa Rosa. Okay. Good night. Take care.